Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the marble streets of Constantinople, where East met West in a blaze of golden domes and shimmering mosaics, where emperors ruled from palaces that seemed to touch heaven itself, where the Roman Empire refused to die and instead transformed into something stranger, more beautiful, more enduring than anyone could have imagined. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We walk the Mise, the great avenue that cut through the heart of the city, past silk merchants and spice sellers, past icons gleaming with gold leaf and saints who seem to watch with living eyes. We stand before the Hagia Sophia, that impossible dome that floats above the earth as if held by angels, where light pours through windows and turns the air itself to gold. We imagine the chants echoing through incense-laden darkness, the emperors crowned beneath heaven's gaze, the scholars debating in libraries that held the wisdom of ages, the sailors arriving from distant ports with Persian carpets and Indian jewels and stories of lands beyond the edge of known maps. Each episode here isn't just about dates and dynasties. It's not about memorizing emperors or cataloguing conquests or tracing the slow decline catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived, the baker rising before dawn to feed a city of 500,000 souls, the mosaic artist placing tiny glass cubes one by one to create faces that would outlive empires, the child watching the imperial procession pass in clouds of purple silk and golden thread, wondering what it means to rule the world. It's about the beauty they created, the mysteries they preserved, the light they kept burning through 1,000 years of darkness, waiting patiently for us to remember. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. The year is 330, and the Roman Empire stands at a crossroads it doesn't yet understand. For centuries, Rome has been the eternal city, the centre of the known world, the place where all roads lead and all power resides. But something is shifting beneath the surface of imperial certainty. The empire has grown too vast, too unwieldy, stretched across 3 continents and a dozen cultures that speak different tongues and worship different gods. Barbarian tribes press against northern frontiers. Persian armies threaten eastern provinces. Economic strain runs through the system like cracks in marble that no amount of imperial propaganda can hide. Emperor Constantine understands what others refuse to see. Rome, for all its grandeur and history, sits in the wrong place for an empire that must defend itself on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Italian peninsula juts into the Mediterranean like a beautiful irrelevance, too far west to respond quickly to threats emerging from the east, too distant from the wealthy provinces of Egypt and Syria and Asia Minor that actually fund the imperial machine. The symbolic weight of Rome, its senate and temples and 7 hills, cannot overcome the geographic reality that the world has moved on. Constantine himself embodies this transformation. He has spent most of his reign not in Rome but on campaign, moving from frontier to frontier, fighting usurpers and barbarians, and anyone who challenges his authority. He has seen the empire from its edges, from the Rhine to the Danube to the Euphrates, and he knows that power no longer radiates from a single eternal city. Power goes where the emperor goes, where the armies march, where the money flows. Rome is a museum of past glories. The future lies elsewhere. The emperor has recently done something that would have been unthinkable to his predecessors. He has embraced Christianity, a religion that was persecuting victims just a generation ago, executed in arenas for the entertainment of crowds. His conversion at the Milvian Bridge, whether genuine religious experience or calculated political move, has changed the character of Roman authority forever. The old gods who protected Rome for 1,000 years are being set aside. New symbols, new rituals, new sources of legitimacy are emerging. If the gods can change, why not the capital itself? There is a place Constantine has been thinking about, a city that exists but barely matters in the grand scheme of imperial geography. Byzantium, a Greek trading post perched on a triangular peninsula where Europe meets Asia, where the waters of the Black Sea funnel through narrow straits into the Mediterranean. He visited it years ago during his campaigns against a rival emperor. The location imprinted itself on his mind like a vision. 3 sides protected by water, easily defensible, commanding the trade routes between east and west, between the grain fields of Egypt and the timber forests of the north, close enough to the threatened frontiers to respond quickly, far enough from old Rome to make a clean break with the past. The decision forms slowly, not as a sudden revelation, but as an accumulation of practical necessities that become undeniable. Constantinople will be the new Rome, not a temporary headquarters or military camp, but a proper capital with all the grandeur and ceremony that empire requires. The announcement, when it comes, shocks the old aristocracy in Italy. How can Rome not be Rome? How can the eternal city be replaced? But Constantine is not asking permission. He is an emperor who won his throne through civil war, who converted to a new god, who understands that survival requires transformation. The construction begins in 326. Architects and engineers arrive from across the empire. Marble is stripped from older cities to build new forums and palaces. The walls rise quickly, embracing the peninsula in stone. A hippodrome for chariot races, because every proper Roman city needs bread and circuses. A palace complex that will eventually sprawl across acres of terraced gardens and audience halls. Churches instead of temples, because this will be a Christian capital for a Christian empire, the Hagia Irene, dedicated to holy peace. Others will follow. Constantine brings relics, holy objects that will sanctify the new city and give it spiritual authority to match its political power. Fragments of the true cross, the tools that built Noah's Ark, or so the stories claim, the Virgin Mary's robe. Whether these objects are genuine matters less than what they represent, the transfer of divine favour from old Rome to new. The city is consecrated with Christian ceremony, but also with older rituals, pagan rites that acknowledge the spirits of place and water. Constantine is practical. He will take blessings from any source that offers them. The emperor dies in 337, just 11 years after founding his city. He is baptized on his deathbed, finally completing his conversion. Constantinople is still raw and new, its monuments unfinished. Its population a mixture of opportunistic settlers and forced relocations. But the precedent is set. The capital has moved east. The Roman Empire has begun its transformation into something that will eventually be called Byzantine, though its people will always call themselves Romans, will insist they are the unbroken continuation of an empire that never truly fell, that merely changed its language from Latin to Greek, and its god from Jupiter to Christ. The old Rome will fade slowly, sacked by barbarians in 410 and 455, finally falling to Germanic tribes in 476. But by then it won't matter. The real Rome, the living Rome, the Rome that commands armies and collects taxes and maintains the fiction of eternal empire, will be thriving on the Bosphorus, growing rich on trade, building churches that make the old temples look small and dark. Constantinople will stand for more than 1,000 years, until 1453, surviving everything that destroys the Western Empire. And it all begins here, with one emperor's pragmatic vision, one decision to abandon the past and build the future somewhere new. The peninsula Constantine chose was not empty wilderness, but an ancient settlement with its own long, tangled history. Byzantium had existed for nearly 1,000 years before Constantine arrived, founded according to legend in the 7th century before Christ by a Greek colonist named Byzas. The oracle at Delphi told him to settle opposite the land of the blind, a cryptic instruction that made sense when he saw the existing Greek colony at Chalcedon, across the strait on the Asian shore. That settlement had ignored the far superior peninsula on the European side, blessed with deep harbours and defensible geography. They must be blind, Byzas thought, to miss such an obvious advantage. He claimed the peninsula and built his town. For centuries, Byzantium remained a minor player in the great struggles of the ancient world. It was conquered by Persians, liberated by Greeks, allied with Sparta, then with Athens, changing sides as survival required. Philip of Macedon besieged it. His son Alexander largely ignored it. The Romans absorbed it during their eastern expansion, one more Greek city among hundreds. It had strategic importance as a crossing point between continents, but never enough wealth or power to determine its own fate. It watched empires rise and fall from its triangle of land, adapting to whoever held power, surviving through flexibility rather than strength. The geography that attracted Constantine had shaped the city's character from the beginning. The peninsula juts into the water like a ship's prow pointing toward Asia. To the south, the Sea of Marmara stretches wide and blue toward the Mediterranean. To the north, the Golden Horn curves like a sickle, a perfect natural harbour deep enough for the largest ships, protected from storms, impossible to assault from the sea. To the east, the Bosphorus Strait narrows to less than a mile, channeling all maritime traffic between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean through waters the city commands completely. Constantine's engineers surveyed the site with Roman precision, measuring distances, calculating grades, identifying sources of fresh water. The peninsula offered everything a great capital required: room to grow, stone quarries nearby, forests for timber within reasonable distance, agricultural hinterland in Thrace to feed a growing population. The waters themselves provided natural defence that would save enormous expense in fortifications. A single wall across the landward neck of the peninsula could seal the city from ground assault. The sea walls could be lighter, cheaper, because no ancient army could mount an effective amphibious assault against defended shores. The old city of Byzantium occupied just the tip of the peninsula, a fraction of what Constantine envisioned. He expanded the boundaries dramatically, encompassing hills and valleys that had been pasture and vineyard. The new land walls rose 4 miles west of the old Byzantium, enclosing an area that could hold hundreds of thousands of residents. This was not modest expansion, but wholesale reimagining of urban scale. Constantine was building for empire, for eternity, for a city that would rival Rome itself in size and grandeur. The foundation ceremonies blended Christian and pagan traditions in ways that would have scandalized purists on either side. Christian bishops blessed the cornerstones of churches. Pagan priests performed ancient rites to placate local spirits. Constantine himself, wearing the purple robes of Roman emperors and the symbols of Christian faith, walked the circuit of the new walls carrying a spear, marking boundaries in a ritual that echoed Romulus founding Rome. When attendants asked why he walked so far, extending the walls to such ambitious dimensions, Constantine reportedly replied that he would continue until the invisible guide walking before him chose to stop. Whether he meant Christ or some pagan genius loci was left deliberately ambiguous. The construction attracted workers from across the empire: stonemasons, carpenters, architects, engineers, all drawn by imperial wages and the chance to build something unprecedented. Marble columns were brought from temples in Asia Minor and Greece, sometimes voluntarily donated, sometimes simply appropriated by imperial decree. Ancient statues that had stood in forums and sanctuaries for centuries were uprooted and transported to Constantinople to give the new city an instant heritage, a visual connection to classical past. The serpent column from Delphi, cast to commemorate Greek victory over Persia 1,000 years earlier, was installed in the Hippodrome. History itself was being relocated. Constantine built the Mese, the great avenue that would become the spine of the city, running from the imperial palace near the tip of the peninsula westward through a series of forums to the land walls. The road was wide enough for imperial processions, lined with covered porticos where merchants could sell their goods, protected from rain and sun. Forums opened at intervals, public spaces adorned with columns and statues where citizens could gather, gossip, conduct business, watch the world parade past. The largest, the Forum of Constantine, featured a massive porphyry column topped with a statue of the emperor himself, portrayed as Apollo, sun god, and bringer of light. Christian and pagan imagery merged into something new. The Hippodrome was essential, because Roman political legitimacy required public entertainment and the appearance of popular consent. The massive arena could hold tens of thousands of spectators for chariot races, athletic contests, public executions, imperial ceremonies. The racing factions, blues and greens, would become more than sports teams but political parties, religious affiliations, social identities that could shake the empire when their rivalries exploded into violence. But that lay in the future. For now, the Hippodrome represented continuity with Roman tradition, proof that Constantinople was not abandoning the customs that made Rome great, merely transplanting them to better soil. Churches rose throughout the city, marking the Christian character of Constantine's vision. The Hagia Irene, Church of Holy Peace, stood near the imperial palace. The Church of the Holy Apostles would eventually house Constantine's tomb. the emperor choosing to be buried surrounded by cenotaphs of the 12 apostles, positioning himself as the 13th, equal to those who walked with Christ. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not just political capital, but holy city, New Jerusalem, the Christian empire made manifest in stone and gold. The population came slowly at first, then in waves. Constantine offered incentives, tax breaks, free grain distributions, housing subsidies. Old Roman aristocratic families were encouraged to establish residences, bringing their wealth and prestige. Merchants recognized opportunity and arrived to serve the imperial court and growing citizenry. Craftsmen, shopkeepers, labourers, slaves all followed the money. Within a generation, Constantinople had grown from provincial town to metropolis, a city that could legitimately claim to rival Rome in size, if not yet in cultural authority. The dedication ceremony in 330 took place on May 11th, a date chosen by astrologers for its auspicious alignment of stars. Constantine proclaimed Constantinople the new Rome, equal in dignity and privilege to the old capital. The Senate was duplicated, a pale copy at first, but gradually gaining real authority. The city received its own prefect, its own urban cohorts, its own grain dole. All the apparatus of Roman governance was replicated, as if sheer institutional mimicry could transfer the essence of empire from Italy to Thrace, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. The Roman aristocracy in Italy greeted Constantine's new capital with barely concealed contempt mixed with dawning horror. For 1,000 years, Rome had been the centre of their world, not merely politically but spiritually, the source of their identity and prestige. Their families had built fortunes through proximity to power, through seats in the Senate, through contracts to supply the armies, through ownership of the forums and basilicas where business was conducted and justice dispensed. Now this upstart soldier emperor, this convert to a religion they still regarded with suspicion, proposed to make some provincial Greek town his capital, as if empire were portable furniture that could be moved on imperial whim. The old families didn't openly rebel because Constantine had proven himself too dangerous to oppose directly. He had defeated every rival who challenged him, had executed senators who plotted against him, had demonstrated the kind of ruthless pragmatism that made martyrdom seem less appealing than accommodation. But they resisted in subtler ways, through delay and obstruction, through spreading rumours that Constantinople was cursed or ill-omened, through simple refusal to relocate themselves and their wealth to the east. Rome had survived barbarian invasions and civil wars. Surely it would survive this too. But Constantine was not merely making a symbolic gesture. He was systematically transferring the apparatus of empire. Tax revenues that once flowed to Rome now went to Constantinople. Military commands were issued from the Bosphorus, not the Tiber. Ambassadors from Persia and Germania and beyond were received in the new palace, not the old. The Senate in Rome continued to meet, continued to debate and vote on matters that mattered less and less, a theatrical performance of authority that everyone recognized as hollow. Real power had moved east. The Christian community responded very differently. For them, Constantine's new capital represented vindication, the final proof that God favoured their faith over the old pagan gods. Just a generation ago, Christians were being fed to lions in the Colosseum. Now a Christian emperor was building a Christian capital, a city where churches rather than temples would dominate the skyline, where bishops rather than augurs would advise the throne. Jerusalem was lost to Roman control, occupied by peoples who did not recognise Christ. But Constantinople could become a new Jerusalem, a holy city under Christian rule, where the faithful could gather without fear of persecution. Bishops flocked to the new capital, establishing sees and jockeying for imperial favour. The Patriarch of Constantinople, originally a minor ecclesiastical position subordinate to older churches in Antioch and Alexandria, began to grow in importance simply through proximity to imperial power. The emperor attended services, endowed churches with land and treasure, consulted with religious leaders on matters of doctrine and policy. Church and state were becoming intertwined in ways that would define Byzantine civilization for the next 1,000 years, each legitimizing the other, each dependent on the other for authority. Common people responded to incentives. Constantinople offered opportunities that exhausted, overcrowded Rome no longer could. The free grain distribution, the bread dole that had kept the Roman mob pacified for centuries, was replicated in the new capital. Public baths, theatres, markets, all the amenities of urban life appeared with astonishing speed. Jobs were plentiful for anyone willing to work in construction, service industries, or the expanding imperial bureaucracy. Land was cheap compared to the astronomical prices in Rome. A man of modest means could establish himself, buy property, build a future. The Greek-speaking population of the Eastern Empire felt a quiet satisfaction at the shift. For centuries they had been conquered subjects of Latin-speaking Romans, their culture admired but their political aspirations limited. Now the capital sat in Greek-speaking territory. The official language remained Latin for government documents and military commands, but Greek was the language of the streets, the markets, the churches. The emperor might claim to be building a new Rome, but everyone understood it was really a Greek city with Roman pretensions, a reversal of the cultural hierarchy that had existed since Pompey conquered the East. Merchants and traders recognized immediately what Constantine had created. The Bosphorus was the choke point between two worlds, and whoever controlled it could tax, regulate, and profit from every ship that passed through. Grain from the Black Sea ports, slaves from the steppes, furs and amber from the north, silk from China, arriving via Persian intermediaries, spices from India and beyond. All of it had to pass through the straits, and Constantinople sat astride the route like a customs house blessed by geography. The city would grow rich not just from imperial largesse but from commercial advantage that no rival could match. Architects and artists saw something else, an opportunity to create without the weight of ancient tradition crushing every innovation. Rome was a museum, every building site layered with history, every project compared unfavourably to the works of Augustus or Trajan. Constantinople was a blank canvas where ambition could express itself freely. Yes, they brought columns and statues from older cities, but these were arranged in new configurations, new spatial relationships. The forums weren't copies of Roman models, but adaptations, experiments, ideas that would have been rejected as too radical in conservative Rome. The military appreciated the strategic logic even if they mourned the loss of Rome's symbolic power. The frontiers that mattered were in the east, where Persia remained a constant threat, and in the north, where Gothic and Hunnic tribes probed for weakness. Marching from Rome to the Danube or Euphrates wasted weeks of campaign season. From Constantinople, armies could deploy in days. The imperial fleet, based in the Golden Horn, could project power across the Mediterranean and Black Sea simultaneously. Defense, logistics, rapid response, all the practical requirements of maintaining empire were better served from the new location. Within a generation, the debate was over. Constantinople had won simply by functioning, by demonstrating that empire could survive without Rome, that power really did go where the emperor went. The old capital declined slowly, its population dwindling as the wealthy and ambitious departed for better opportunities in the east. The aqueducts fell into disrepair, the forums grew shabby, barbarian mercenaries camped in buildings that once housed senators. Rome became what Constantine had recognized it already was, a beautiful corpse sustained by nostalgia and fading glory. But Constantinople thrived, growing richer and more populous with each passing decade. By the time Theodosius made Christianity the sole legal religion of the empire in 380, the transformation was complete. This was not New Rome but Byzantium, though its people would never accept that name, would always insist they were Romans, the true inheritors of Caesar and Augustus. The empire had split in practice, if not in theory, east and west drifting apart. Speaking different languages, facing different threats, developing different identities. When the Western Empire finally collapsed in 476, Constantinople barely noticed. They were too busy being the only Rome that mattered, the empire that refused to fall. The strangest thing about the Byzantine Empire is that it never called itself Byzantine, and the people who lived in Constantinople for 11 centuries never stopped insisting they were Romans, even when they spoke Greek exclusively, when Latin had faded from daily use, except in religious liturgy and legal formulas, even when their art and architecture and theology had evolved into something the old Romans would have found alien and possibly heretical. Even when they ruled nothing in Italy except scattered coastal towns, and the emperors crowned in Rome were Germanic kings who couldn't read. The Byzantines insisted they were Romans, the unbroken continuation of the empire founded by Augustus, the legitimate inheritors of a tradition that stretched back through the Republic to Romulus and the Seven Hills. This insistence was not delusion, but sophisticated political theology. The Byzantine worldview held that God had ordained the Roman Empire as the final earthly kingdom before Christ's return. Daniel's prophecy spoke of 4 kingdoms, the last being Rome, which would endure until the end times. Therefore Rome could not truly fall without the world ending. When barbarians occupied Italy and deposed the last Western emperor, Byzantines explained this as temporary disorder, not imperial collapse. The empire continued in Constantinople, the true capital, where legitimate emperors still ruled by divine right and apostolic succession. The word Byzantine itself was invented by Western European scholars in the 16th century, centuries after Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. They needed a term to distinguish the medieval Greek-speaking Christian empire from the classical Latin-speaking pagan empire, so they reached back to Byzantium, the old name for Constantine's city. But this created a false division, implying a break in continuity that Byzantines themselves never recognized. To them, there was only one empire, one unbroken line of emperors from Augustus to Constantine the one Roman state that adapted and survived while the West collapsed into feudal chaos. This paradox, this insistence on Roman identity while becoming something completely different, shaped Byzantine culture profoundly. They preserved classical texts, copied ancient manuscripts, studied Greek philosophy and Roman law with reverence for the past. But they also innovated constantly, developing new forms of religious art, new architectural techniques, new systems of government and taxation, and military organization. They were simultaneously conservative and creative, anchored in tradition and wildly experimental, looking backward and forward at the same time. Their Christianity embodied this tension. The old Roman religion had been pragmatic, a civic cult concerned with performing rituals correctly to maintain divine favor for the state. Byzantine Christianity absorbed this attitude, seeing the empire as God's instrument on earth, the emperor as Christ's viceroy. Religious orthodoxy is essential to political stability. Heresy wasn't just theological error, but treason, a threat to the cosmic order that sustained the empire. The state enforced religious unity with the same ruthless efficiency Rome had once used to maintain peace on the frontiers. Yet Byzantine theology also pursued questions the old Romans would have found incomprehensible. The nature of Christ's divinity, whether Mary should be called Theotokos, God-bearer, whether icons were windows to heaven or idolatrous graven images. These debates consumed decades, sparked civil wars, destroyed careers and lives. Emperors called ecumenical councils to resolve disputes, then changed their minds when political calculations shifted. The passion invested in these arguments seems baffling to modern minds. But for Byzantines, getting the theology right was literally a matter of imperial survival, because God would not protect an empire that worshipped incorrectly. The military system showed similar adaptation. The old Roman legion, heavy infantry and disciplined formations, gave way to more flexible cavalry-centered armies that could match Persian and later Arab tactics. The themes, military districts where soldier farmers held land in exchange for service, replaced the professional standing army that had bankrupted the Western Empire. Byzantine generals studied the ancient military manuals, but adapted their teachings to contemporary threats, preserving Roman discipline and organization while adopting enemy weapons and tactics when these proved superior. Diplomatically, Byzantines developed sophistication that made Roman methods look crude. They couldn't match the military power they once commanded, couldn't field the massive armies that conquered from Britain to Mesopotamia. Instead, they relied on intelligence networks, careful marriage alliances, strategic bribery, manipulation of barbarian tribes into fighting each other. The court ceremonial became a weapon, elaborate rituals designed to awe foreign ambassadors into recognizing Byzantine superiority. The emperor sat behind curtains, revealed only at calculated moments. Mechanical lions roared beside the throne. Golden birds sang in jeweled trees. The message was clear: you're in the presence of power beyond your comprehension. The bureaucracy grew into something the old empire never achieved, a vast civil service that could function regardless of who sat on the throne. Elaborate hierarchies of officials with titles like logothete and domestikos managed taxation, military logistics, religious affairs, foreign policy. The system was corrupt, certainly, shot through with bribery and nepotism. But it was also remarkably efficient, capable of extracting revenue from a shrinking empire, maintaining armies in the field year after year, preserving institutional memory across generations. Constantinople itself embodied the contradiction. It was built in conscious imitation of Rome, with forums and baths and a hippodrome, all the architectural markers of Roman civilization. But the buildings were different, lighter, more vertical, featuring domes that seemed to float rather than the heavy barrel vaults Romans preferred. The interior spaces glowed with mosaics in gold and coloured glass, creating luminous atmospheres unlike anything in the Western Empire. The churches dominated the skyline rather than temples, and their decoration told stories in visual language that illiterate congregations could read like books. The economy mixed old and new. Byzantines maintained the Roman gold currency, the solidus, keeping it pure and stable for centuries when Western Europe devolved to barter and local copper coins. This monetary discipline allowed long-distance trade, complex credit arrangements, a commercial sophistication that wouldn't reappear in the West until the Renaissance. But they also developed new industries, silk production most famously, supposedly stolen from China by monks who smuggled silkworm eggs in hollow canes. The imperial monopoly on silk became a cornerstone of Byzantine wealth. The library tradition continued but shifted from Latin to Greek. Byzantine scholars copied Plato and Aristotle, Homer and Euripides, preserving texts that would otherwise have vanished when Western libraries burned or rotted. But they also produced their own literature, histories and hagiographies and theological treatises, often writing in a deliberately archaic Greek that mimicked classical models. They were simultaneously preserving the past and creating something new, maintaining continuity while adapting to changed circumstances. This ability to be two things at once, Roman and Greek, Christian and classical, conservative and innovative, helps explain how Byzantium survived when the Western Empire collapsed. They weren't rigid, weren't bound by formulas that worked in the past but failed in the present. They adapted, incorporated, synthesized, always insisting they remained true to tradition even as they transformed it beyond recognition. The empire Constantine founded would last until 1453, more than 1100 years, surviving invasions, civil wars, religious schisms, economic collapse, everything that destroyed lesser states. And through it all, they remained convinced they were Romans, the last Romans, keeping civilization alive while barbarians ruled the ruins of the West. Historians have puzzled for centuries over how Constantinople endured when Rome fell, how one half of the empire collapsed, while the other thrived for another 1,000 years. The easy answer points to geography, and certainly location mattered immensely. Constantinople commanded a peninsula protected on three sides by water, defensible with relatively modest fortifications compared to the endless frontiers Rome tried to guard. The Theodosian walls, completed in 413, created a triple barrier of ditches, outer walls, and massive inner walls 40 feet high that no medieval army could breach. The city survived siege after siege, by Avars and Persians and Arabs and Bulgars, because stone and water and strategic position made conquest nearly impossible without a powerful navy and patient siege craft that few enemies possessed. But geography alone cannot explain 11 centuries of survival. The Western Empire had defensible positions too, fortified cities and mountain passes and river lines. Rome itself had walls, yet the West fell anyway, fragmented into barbarian kingdoms that bore Roman names but abandoned Roman institutions. Something about the East allowed adaptation where the West ossified, encouraged survival where the West accepted defeat. The theories multiply, each capturing part of the truth, none quite explaining everything. Wealth was fundamental. The eastern provinces were simply richer than the West, more urbanized, more commercially active, better connected to trade routes that brought silk from China and spices from India. Egypt provided grain that fed Constantinople reliably, unlike the North African supplies that Rome depended on until Vandals captured Carthage. Syria and Asia Minor produced olive oil, wine, textiles, luxury goods that commanded high prices in markets from Persia to Britain. The tax base was larger and more resilient, capable of supporting armies and bureaucracies even when territories were lost. The Eastern Empire also faced fewer barbarian invasions in its early critical centuries. The Germanic tribes that overwhelmed the West largely bypassed Constantinople, drawn toward the richer pickings in Gaul and Italy and Spain. The Huns swept past, heading for easier targets. The Goths who sacked Rome had been Roman allies and mercenaries who turned on their employers, but this happened in the West while the Eastern court played different factions against each other. Geography helped here too, the straits and mountains creating natural barriers that channeled invasions away from the heart of Byzantine territory. Military innovation kept Byzantine armies competitive, even when outnumbered. The development of Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that burned on water and couldn't be extinguished, gave Byzantine naval forces a decisive advantage. The formula was a closely guarded state secret, never written down, passed from emperor to emperor through oral tradition. Enemy fleets that approached Constantinople found themselves engulfed in liquid fire that turned the sea itself into an inferno. Exactly what Greek fire consisted of remains unknown to this day, though petroleum, sulfur, and quicklime likely played roles. What matters is that it worked, spectacularly, terrorizing enemies and preserving Byzantine control of the waterways. The theme system transformed military organization in ways that solved problems that destroyed the Western Empire. Instead of professional soldiers who required constant pay and could revolt when the money ran out, the themes created soldier farmers who held land in exchange for military service. They had personal stakes in defending their territories, couldn't be bribed or turned as easily as mercenaries, provided troops without draining the treasury. The system was flexible, expandable during prosperous times, contractable during crises, sustainable across generations in ways the old professional legions never were. Diplomacy became a Byzantine art form, refined to a degree that made Roman methods look primitive. The Office of Barbarians maintained detailed records of every tribe and kingdom beyond the frontiers, tracking lineages, feuds, ambitions, vulnerabilities. Byzantine gold bribed chiefs to attack each other, rather than the empire. Byzantine missionaries converted tribes to Orthodox Christianity, creating cultural ties and political influence. Byzantine princesses married foreign kings, bearing children who might inherit both kingdoms and unite them under Byzantine influence. Every treaty, every alliance, every marriage was calculated to move in an endless game where military force was just one option among many. Religious unity, paradoxically, both strengthened and weakened the empire. The insistence on Orthodox Christianity as essential to Byzantine identity created powerful social cohesion, a shared faith that transcended ethnic and linguistic differences. The emperor, as God's representative on earth, commanded obedience that secular rulers in the fragmented West could never match. But religious disputes also tore the empire apart repeatedly. The monophysite controversy over Christ's nature alienated Egypt and Syria, making them less willing to resist Arab conquest in the 7th century. The iconoclast controversy over religious images sparked civil war that lasted over a century. Every theological debate became political crisis because church and state were inseparable. The survival of classical learning gave Byzantines technological and organizational advantages. Roman law codes, preserved and updated, created legal predictability that facilitated commerce and administration. Greek mathematics and engineering allowed construction of buildings like the Hagia Sophia that seemed to defy physical possibility. Medical knowledge preserved from Galen and Hippocrates kept Byzantine doctors more effective than Western leeches and prayer. The bureaucracy could function because officials were literate, trained in rhetoric and administration, capable of managing complex systems that would have collapsed without educated personnel. But perhaps the deepest reason was cultural flexibility masked as rigid traditionalism. Byzantines convinced themselves they never changed, that they were eternally Roman, forever faithful to ancient models. This self-image allowed them to change constantly while maintaining psychological continuity. They adopted cavalry tactics from Persia, while insisting they were following Roman military tradition. They developed bureaucratic innovations while claiming to preserve ancient administrative systems. They created new art forms while maintaining they were simply honouring old styles. This ability to adapt while believing in changelessness let them survive shocks that destroyed less flexible societies. The emperor himself functioned differently than in the West. Western Roman emperors became increasingly irrelevant figures, puppets of barbarian generals who held real power, Byzantine emperors could be deposed, blinded, murdered by rivals, but the institution remained sacred and essential. Usurpers didn't abolish the throne, they claimed it for themselves. The worst emperor was preferable to no emperor, because the emperor's role as Christ's representative sustained the cosmic order. This meant power struggles were fierce, but contained within the system, civil wars that changed rulers without destroying the state. Population density mattered more than often recognized. The Eastern Empire remained urbanized when the West ruralized. Cities meant markets, specialization, innovation, cultural transmission, all the advantages that dense populations provide. Constantinople itself, with 500,000 residents at its peak, generated economic activity and cultural production that no Western city could match. Urban populations were easier to tax, easier to recruit from, easier to control than scattered rural peasants. The cities were also centers of Christianity, with bishops who reinforced imperial authority and provided social services that built loyalty. Yet none of these factors alone explains Byzantine survival. It was the combination, the synergy of geography and wealth and military innovation and diplomatic skill and religious cohesion and cultural adaptability, all working together in ways that created resilience beyond what any single element could provide. The system had redundancy, could lose territories and populations and still function. When Arab conquests took Egypt and Syria and North Africa in the 7th century, the empire contracted to Asia Minor and the Balkans and survived, adapted, eventually pushed back. This ability to absorb catastrophic defeats and continue fighting is what separates empires that last from those that collapse at the first serious crisis. Western historians, writing from the perspective of the fallen Western Empire, often portrayed Byzantium as decadent, effeminate, corrupt, a degraded successor to Roman virility. This judgment says more about Western insecurities than Byzantine realities. The empire that survived was more sophisticated, more adaptable, more successful by the only metric that ultimately matters: endurance. Constantinople stood while Rome fell, and all the theories in the world cannot quite capture the human determination, the institutional resilience, the sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat that kept the empire alive through 11 centuries of existential threats. Modern Istanbul still carries the bones of Constantinople beneath its Ottoman and Turkish layers, a palimpsest city where careful observers can read traces of Byzantine glory through the overwritten present. The Hagia Sophia dominates the skyline as it has for 15 centuries, though minarets now bracket the Great Dome and the interior mosaic spent centuries hidden under plaster when the building served as a mosque. Walking through the enormous nave, you can still feel the spatial magic Byzantine architects achieved, the dome floating impossibly overhead, held by tricks of engineering that seem more divine than mechanical. Light pours through windows at the dome's base, creating the illusion that heaven itself rests on beams of golden radiance rather than brick and mortar. This was the effect Justinian wanted when he commissioned the building in 532, an architectural expression of theological truth, heaven touching earth in the capital of the Christian Empire. The dimensions overwhelm human scale deliberately. The interior stretches over 200 feet long. The dome rises more than 150 feet above the floor. The half-domes and arches create rhythmic spaces that draw the eye upward and outward simultaneously. Byzantine emperors were crowned here for 900 years, standing beneath the dome in the cosmic center of their world, receiving authority from God through the patriarch's blessing, performing rituals that linked earthly power to divine will. The building was theatre as much as church, designed to awe barbarian ambassadors and reinforce Byzantine claims to universal sovereignty. Archaeologists have mapped the original city layout through excavations and Byzantine sources that described Constantinople in exhausting detail. The Messe, the main avenue, ran from the Augustan Plaza near the Hagia Sophia westward through a series of forums to the Gate of Carisius in the land walls. Modern Divaniolu follows approximately the same route, though the Byzantine street lies buried beneath centuries of rebuilding. The forums are mostly gone, built over or filled in, but cisterns beneath the modern city reveal Byzantine engineering genius applied to the problem of water supply. The Basilica cistern, largest of hundreds that honeycomb the ground beneath Istanbul, held 80,000 cubic meters of water in a subterranean palace of columns. Walking through it today, wading through shallow water past endless rows of pillars reflected in dark pools, feels like entering a drowned cathedral. The Byzantines recycled columns from older buildings, grabbing whatever was available, so classical Corinthian capitals sit beside rougher work, and 2 columns rest on Medusa head bases taken from some pagan temple, and placed upside down and sideways because the Byzantine engineers cared about function over symbolism. The cistern supplied the Great Palace with water during sieges when aqueducts might be cut, an insurance policy against conquest that helped the city survive repeated attacks. The Theodosian walls remain the most impressive Byzantine structure still standing. Running from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, triple barriers of stone that made Constantinople the most fortified city in the medieval world. The outer wall stood 25 feet high, with towers at intervals. The inner wall rose 40 feet, with 96 towers that could rain arrows and stones on attackers. A moat 60 feet wide fronted the whole system, filled with water when enemies approached. For 1,000 years, armies broke against these walls, Avars and Persians and Arabs and Bulgars and Russians, none able to breach defences that represented the pinnacle of pre-gunpowder fortification. Sections of the walls still stand, weathered and scarred but fundamentally intact, testimony to Byzantine engineering and the quality of their mortar. You can walk along restored portions, climb towers that Byzantine soldiers manned during sieges, look out over the land approach that countless armies marched across in failed attempts at conquest. The walls speak to the essential defensive mentality of late Byzantium, a civilization that knew it was surrounded, outnumbered, doomed eventually, but determined to survive as long as stone and courage could delay the inevitable. The Great Palace complex is almost entirely gone, built over by Ottoman structures and modern development, but fragments survive in museums and scattered ruins. The palace mosaics, discovered in the 1950s, show scenes of daily life and hunt and animal combat in stunning detail, thousands of tiny coloured stones creating images that seem almost alive. These decorated palace floors where emperors walked, where courtiers schemed, where the machinery of empire turned for centuries. The scenes are secular, classical in subject matter despite the Christian empire that created them, showing Byzantine comfort with pagan artistic traditions even as they persecuted pagan worship. The Hippodrome, scene of chariot races and political riots that could overthrow emperors, survives as a long park called the Sultanahmet Square. The serpent column still stands, bronze coils twisted together, brought from Delphi 1,500 years ago, headless now because Ottoman janissaries used the serpent heads for target practice. The Egyptian obelisk remains on its Roman marble base, hieroglyphics weathered but readable, erected in Theodosius's reign to demonstrate that Constantinople commanded the resources of the ancient world. The German's fountain, Ottoman edition, sits where the Kathisma stood, the imperial box from which emperors watched races and acknowledged the crowd's acclamation. Church ruins scatter across the city, most converted to mosques or secular use, their mosaics plastered over or destroyed. The Chora Church, now the Carrier Museum, preserves the finest Byzantine mosaics and frescoes outside the Hagia Sophia, narrative cycles depicting Christ's life and the Virgin's death in radiant gold and vibrant colours that seem impossibly fresh despite being 700 years old. The artists worked in the late Byzantine period when the empire was dying, controlling little beyond Constantinople itself, yet they created art of breathtaking beauty, investing their diminishing world with transcendent glory. The land wall's most evocative section runs near the Blachenet Palace, where the final siege played out in 1453. The palace of the Porphyrogenitus still stands, 3 stories of brick and marble where emperors born in the Purple Chamber once resided. The nearby gate of Carisius, now called Edirna Gate, is where Constantine the Athenian supposedly died fighting, the last Roman emperor falling in defence of his city. No marker commemorates him. The gate is a busy traffic intersection, cars rushing through the archway Byzantine soldiers once defended with their lives. Archaeological excavations continue revealing new fragments of Byzantine Constantinople. Building projects uncover foundations, walls, buried streets. Restoration work on Ottoman buildings sometimes finds Byzantine structures underneath, layers of history stacked like geological strata. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding of how the city looked, how it functioned, how people actually lived, rather than just how chroniclers described them living. The picture that emerges is of a city both grander and more ordinary than legend suggests, capable of breathtaking beauty but also crowded, dirty, dangerous, alive with the full spectrum of human experience. Walking modern Istanbul with Byzantine maps and descriptions, you can partially resurrect the vanished city, can stand where forums once opened and imagine columns and statues, can trace the Mise through modern streets and picture processions, passing in clouds of incense, can look at the Golden Horn and see merchant ships crowding the harbour with cargo from the world's end. The city Constantine founded never completely died. It transformed, was conquered and rebuilt and renamed. But the bones remain, the geography that made it strategically perfect, the walls that defined its limits, the great church that still dominates the skyline. Constantinople lives in Istanbul the way Rome lives in its medieval and modern descendants, a ghost city haunting the present, whispering stories to anyone willing to listen. Justinian came to power in 527, determined to restore the Roman Empire to its ancient glory, and for a moment it almost seemed possible. He was born a peasant in what is now North Macedonia, spoke Latin with a provincial accent, rose through his uncle's favour to become Emperor of the East when the West had been lost for half a century. But Justinian refused to accept that loss as permanent. In his mind, the barbarian kingdoms in Italy and North Africa and Spain were temporary disorders, rebel provinces that could be reclaimed by legitimate Roman authority. He would spend his reign and bankrupt his empire trying to prove this theory correct, and the evidence of his ambition still dominates Constantinople in the form of the Hagia Sophia. The earlier church on the site had burned during the Nika riots in 532, when chariot racing factions escalated from sports rivalry to full-scale insurrection that nearly overthrew Justinian. The emperor wanted to flee, was prepared to abandon the capital and save his life, but his wife Theodora delivered a speech that became legendary, declaring she would rather die an empress than live a refugee, reminding him that purple made an excellent burial shroud. Justinian stayed. His general Belisarius trapped the rioters in the hippodrome and massacred 30,000 of them, and from the ashes of rebellion Justinian commissioned a church that would surpass anything the world had seen. He chose Anthemius of Tralles, a mathematician and engineer, and Isidore of Miletus, a physicist and architect, giving them unlimited resources and authority to create something unprecedented. The construction employed 10,000 workers, proceeded at astonishing speed, was completed in less than 6 years, a timeline that seems impossible for a building of such size and complexity. Justinian bankrupted provinces to pay for it, appropriated marble from temples across the empire, demanded the finest materials regardless of cost. When the church was dedicated in 537, he supposedly entered alone and declared, "Solomon, I have surpassed you," comparing his achievement to the first temple in Jerusalem. The design broke with traditional basilica forms, creating a centralized space dominated by the massive dome that seems to float overhead without visible support. The trick was pendentives, curved triangular sections that transition from the square base to the circular dome, distributing weight in ways that allowed the dome to rise higher and lighter than Roman engineering thought possible. The dome is actually relatively thin, made from special lightweight brick, progressively lighter as it rises, with 40 ribs transferring stress to the 4 main piers. But the engineering disappears into artistic effect, the dome appearing to hover on light itself, creating spiritual rather than structural impression. The interior was covered in gold mosaics, marble panels and coloured stones that transformed sunlight into radiant glory. The original mosaics were abstract patterns and crosses, following the iconoclast preference that dominated early Byzantine art. But later emperors added figurative images, Christ and the Virgin and saints, who gazed down with enormous eyes from curved surfaces that made them seem alive and watchful. The marble columns were purple porphyry from Egypt, green Thessalian marble, white Parian marble, creating a polychrome effect of imperial richness. Silver covered the iconostasis, gold sheathed the altar, precious stones studded every surface that could hold them. The ambo, the raised platform where scripture was read, stood in the centre beneath the dome, emphasizing the church's role as the place where divine word descended to humanity. The emperor had his own box, the Metatorian, where he participated in services separated from common worshippers, but visible to all, performing his role as Christ's representative on earth. The liturgy developed into elaborate ceremony, processions and chants and incense that lasted for hours, transforming religious service into theatrical spectacle that reinforced imperial ideology through sacred ritual. Justinian's ambition extended beyond architecture to law. He commissioned a comprehensive codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which compiled centuries of imperial edicts, legal commentary, and jurisprudence into organized system that could be taught and applied consistently. The institutes provided textbook for law students. The digest collected opinions of classical Roman jurists. The code organized imperial legislation by topic. The novels added Justinian's own new laws. This legal framework would become the foundation of European law, studied in medieval universities, adapted by developing nation-states, influential down to the present day. His military campaigns initially succeeded beyond expectation. Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in a single brilliant campaign in 533 and 534. Then Italy, fighting the Ostrogoths in a war that dragged on for decades but eventually restored imperial control over Rome and Ravenna and much of the peninsula. Southern Spain was taken from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was again a Roman lake. The empire reunited under single authority, Justinian's name carved on monuments from Libya to the Danube. But the cost was catastrophic. The wars drained the treasury, required constant taxation that impoverished provinces, depopulated Italy through decades of fighting that reduced cities to ruins and farmland to wilderness. The reconquered territories required garrisons the empire couldn't afford, were vulnerable to new invasions the moment Justinian's attention wavered, and while he focused on reclaiming the west, the Persian frontier erupted in warfare that threatened the empire's heartland in Syria and Asia Minor. The plague arrived in 541, bubonic pestilence that killed millions across the Mediterranean world. It struck Constantinople with particular force, killing thousands daily at the peak, overwhelming burial capacity, forcing disposal of corpses in towers and ships and mass graves. Justinian himself caught the disease and recovered, but the empire never fully recovered. Population collapse reduced tax revenues and military recruitment. Agricultural production fell. Trade networks were disrupted. The economic foundation that supported Justinian's ambitions crumbled beneath demographic catastrophe. His wife, Theodora, died in 548, and something in Justinian died with her. She had been his partner, his advisor, his political equal despite her scandalous background as an actress and possibly prostitute before their marriage. Byzantine law forbade senators from marrying actresses, so Justinian had his uncle change the law, then married her anyway, elevating her to Augusta and consulting her on all major decisions. Her intelligence and ruthlessness balanced his grandiosity and idealism. Without her, he became more rigid, more isolated, more convinced of his own righteousness even as his policies failed. The reconquered West began slipping away even before Justinian died in 565. The Lombards invaded Italy just 3 years after his death, seizing much of the territory Byzantine armies had fought decades to reclaim. North Africa faced Berber revolts. Spain was abandoned entirely. The empire contracted back toward its eastern core, surrendering the dream of universal Roman restoration. Future emperors would be more pragmatic, less obsessed with recovering a past that couldn't be restored, more focused on defending what remained rather than chasing vanished glory. Yet Justinian's legacy endured in stone and lore and cultural memory. The Hagia Sophia stood as proof that Byzantium could still create wonders, that the empire possessed resources and will to build for eternity. The legal codes provided intellectual framework that survived the empire itself, shaping how Europe understood justice and governance. The very attempt to restore Rome, even in failure, reinforced Byzantine identity as the true Romans, the legitimate empire, the civilization that maintained ancient standards, while barbarians squatted in Rome's ruins. Justinian dreamed impossibly large, failed magnificently, and in failing created monuments that outlasted his empire by centuries. The great church he built still dominates Istanbul's skyline, still draws the eye upward, still performs its original function of making humanity feel small before divine immensity made manifest in brick and gold and light. In 726, Emperor Leo III issued an edict that would tear the Byzantine Empire apart for more than a century and reveal the deepest tensions in Byzantine Christianity. he ordered the destruction of icons, the religious images of Christ and Mary and saints that filled Byzantine churches and homes, objects of veneration that millions believed held spiritual power. Icons weren't mere decorations but windows to heaven, painted according to strict conventions that made them holy objects in themselves. People prayed before icons, kissed them, believed they performed miracles, healings, interventions in daily life. Leo declared this idolatry, worship of images rather than God, violation of the second commandment that forbade graven images. The icons must be destroyed. The reasons for Leo's iconoclasm remain debated. He had just survived the Arab siege of 717 to 718, when Muslim armies besieged Constantinople for a year before withdrawing in defeat. Islamic theology strictly forbade religious images, considering them idolatrous. Perhaps Leo was influenced by this critique, or hoped to make Christianity more acceptable to Muslim populations the empire hoped to reconvert. Perhaps he genuinely believed icons had become objects of superstitious worship that distracted from true faith. Perhaps he wanted to break the power of monasteries that produced and profited from icon veneration. Whatever his motivations, the result was civil war conducted through theological argument and physical violence. Imperial agents entered churches and whitewashed over mosaics, scraped away frescoes, destroyed painted panels. Monks and nuns who resisted were imprisoned, tortured, sometimes killed. The Patriarch of Constantinople, who opposed iconoclasm, was deposed and replaced with a compliant bishop. But opposition grew rather than diminished, because icons had become so central to Byzantine spiritual life that their removal felt like violation of Christianity itself. The theological arguments became extraordinarily sophisticated. Iconoclasts argued that depicting Christ in images implied his divine and human natures could be separated, falling into the Nestorian heresy condemned centuries earlier. If you paint Christ, you paint only his human form, not his divinity. Therefore the image is incomplete and misleading. Icons encourage worship of material objects, exactly what pagans did with their idols. True Christianity should be aniconic, focused on scripture and sacrament rather than pictures. Iconodules, defenders of icons, developed equally complex counter-arguments. Christ became incarnate, took physical form, therefore depicting him was not only permissible but theologically necessary. To deny Christ could be depicted was to deny the incarnation itself, falling into Docetism, the heresy that Christ only appeared human. Icons weren't worshipped, they were venerated, honour passing through the image to the prototype, just as showing respect to the emperor's portrait wasn't worshipping wood and paint, but acknowledging the emperor's authority. The distinction between worship and veneration became critical theological ground. Women played unusual prominent roles in the controversy. Empress Irene, ruling as regent for her young son, convened the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which condemned iconoclasm and restored icon veneration. Her motivation was partly political, seeking support from icon-venerating populations, but also perhaps personal conviction. Icons were particularly important to women's spirituality, objects they could own and control in a church dominated by male clergy. Destroying icons diminished women's religious agency, and restoring them empowered female piety. But iconoclasm returned under Emperor Leo V in 814, sparking another generation of persecutions and theological combat. The debates grew more vicious, more personal, more politically charged. Iconoclasts accused iconodules of pagan superstition. Iconodules accused iconoclasts of destroying tradition and beauty. Monasteries, which produced most icons, became centres of resistance. Monks who refused to destroy icons were flogged, exiled, had their property confiscated. Some fled to Italy, taking icons and artistic traditions that would influence Western medieval art. The controversy wasn't purely theological, but revealed class and cultural tensions. Iconoclasm found support among military aristocracy in eastern provinces, areas influenced by Islamic artistic traditions and frontier pragmatism. Icon veneration was strongest in cities, among monks and lower clergy, in areas where traditional Byzantine culture ran deepest. The division mapped roughly onto Greek versus Oriental populations, civilian versus military worldviews, capital versus provinces. Each side saw the other as threatening the essential character of empire and faith. The final restoration of icons came in 843 under Empress Theodora, another woman regent who championed religious images. The date, the first Sunday of Lent, became the Feast of Orthodoxy, still celebrated in Orthodox Christianity as victory of true faith over heresy. But the century of iconoclasm had transformed Byzantine art. The earlier naturalistic style, which attempted realistic human representation, gave way to more stylized iconic forms. Figures became flatter, more abstract, more obviously symbolic rather than representational. The trauma of destruction shaped what emerged afterward. The deeper mystery is why this issue provoked such passion, such violence, such sustained conflict. Modern observers struggle to understand how theological hair-splitting about image veneration could tear an empire apart. But for Byzantines, the question went to the heart of how divine and human realms related, whether material reality could carry spiritual meaning, whether the incarnation truly bridged heaven and earth. Icons weren't decoration but theology made visible, proof that God entered the physical world and sanctified it. The iconoclast controversy also revealed the limits of imperial authority over faith. Emperors could command armies, tax populations, execute opponents, but they couldn't simply decree theological truth and expect compliance. The Church, especially monasteries, possessed independent authority that even emperors couldn't crush without risking legitimacy. The failure of iconoclasm showed that Byzantine civilization rested on negotiated consensus between emperor and church, not simple autocracy. When emperors pushed too hard against religious sentiment, they endangered the cosmic order they supposedly represented. The victory of icon veneration shaped Orthodox Christianity permanently. Eastern icons became sacred objects, painted according to strict conventions, blessed and regarded as spiritually potent. The tradition of iconography became central to Orthodox identity, distinguishing it from both Catholic and Protestant Christianity. Byzantine artistic influence spread throughout Orthodox world, Russia and the Balkans adopting not just religious imagery, but entire aesthetic systems. The icons that survived iconoclasm and those painted afterward in traditional styles became treasures, windows to heaven that connect earth to divine realm through colour and gold and sacred geometry. The controversy left scars. Thousands of early Byzantine mosaics and frescoes were destroyed, leaving gaps in art history that can never be filled. We know about works only through descriptions trying to imagine what was lost. The Hagia Sophia's original decoration, whatever it looked like, is gone beneath later figurative mosaics added after iconoclasm ended. Entire artistic traditions were interrupted, forgotten, reconstructed imperfectly. But perhaps the damage itself became meaningful, a reminder that even the most beautiful human creations are fragile, that every attempt to depict the divine is provisional, that the empire itself, for all its claims to eternity, rested on foundations that could crack when fundamental beliefs collided with political power. The year 1204 began with a Christian army camped outside the walls of the greatest Christian city in the world, and everyone knew what was about to happen was wrong. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control, but the Crusaders never reached the Holy Land. Instead, they turned against Constantinople, against fellow Christians, against the city that had preserved classical learning and defended Christendom's eastern frontier for 800 years. The reasons were complicated, tangled in debt and politics and old resentments between Latin West and Greek East. But the result was simple and catastrophic. On April 13th, 1204, the Crusaders breached the Theodosian walls, poured into Constantinople, and subjected the city to 3 days of destruction that it would never fully recover from. The background explains how the impossible happened. The Crusade was organised by Pope Innocent III, who envisioned reclaiming Jerusalem lost to Saladin in 1187. The Crusaders contracted with Venice for ships to transport them to Egypt, planning to strike at Muslim power's source before moving on Jerusalem. But when they gathered in Venice, they couldn't pay the agreed price for transport. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, was 90 years old and blind, but still shrewd enough to see opportunity. He offered to defer payment if the Crusaders would help Venice recapture Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders, already in debt and without better options, agreed. Pope Innocent excommunicated them for attacking fellow Christians, then lifted the excommunication when they promised to continue to the Holy Land. But now Alexius Angelus, a Byzantine prince whose father had been deposed and blinded in a palace coup, approached the Crusade leaders with a proposal: help restore his father to the throne in Constantinople, and he would pay their debt to Venice, provide money and troops for the Egyptian campaign, and reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches under papal authority. The offer was too attractive to refuse, though it required attacking the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders told themselves they were correcting an injustice, restoring a legitimate emperor, helping fellow Christians. They sailed to Constantinople in summer 1203, their ships filling the Golden Horn, their army camping outside the walls. This sight terrified the Byzantine population. These weren't Muslim enemies but Christian warriors from the west, theoretically allies, now besieging their capital with Venetian connivance and backing a pretender to the throne. The reigning emperor Alexius III fled rather than fight. The Crusaders installed the blind Isaac II and his son Alexius IV as co-emperors, expecting payment as promised. But the new emperors quickly discovered they couldn't deliver on Alexius IV's promises. The Byzantine treasury was depleted. The population violently opposed church union with Rome, seeing Latin Christianity as heretical, closer to Islam than true orthodoxy. The Crusaders, camped outside the city through winter, grew angry as months passed without payment or support. Relations deteriorated into mutual hatred. In February 1204, a palace revolution overthrew the pro-Latin emperors and installed Alexius V, who declared he would pay the Crusaders nothing and they should leave immediately. The Crusade leaders, furious at being cheated of promised payment, decided to conquer Constantinople outright, divide its territories among themselves, and install a Latin emperor. The Venetians enthusiastically supported this plan. Enrico Dandolo had old grievances against Byzantium and coveted its trade monopolies. The clergy with the Crusade rationalized conquest as punishment for Greek schism, an opportunity to forcibly unite the churches. Everyone convinced themselves they were doing God's work. The assault began on April 9th. The Venetian fleet approached the sea walls, soldiers trying to scale the fortifications from ships lashed together. Byzantine defenders repelled the first attack, raining stones and arrows and Greek fire on the attackers, but on April 12th, the Crusaders modified their approach, using siege towers mounted on ships to reach the top of the walls. In several places they gained toeholds, drove off defenders, opened gates from inside. The walls that had protected Constantinople for 800 years were finally breached, not by Muslim armies that besieged the city repeatedly, but by Christian crusaders who were supposed to be liberators, defenders of the faith. What followed was one of medieval history's worst atrocities. The Crusaders poured into the city and began systematic looting that lasted 3 days. Churches were desecrated, icons smashed or stolen, reliquaries broken open for their jewels. The Hagia Sophia was stripped of its silver iconostasis, its gold altar, its silk hangings. A prostitute was seated on the patriarch's throne and sang obscene songs while drunken soldiers danced around her. Libraries were burned or scattered, manuscripts of classical authors lost forever. Palaces were ransacked, private homes were invaded, occupants murdered or raped without regard for age or gender. The destruction went beyond looting. Ancient bronze statues that had stood in forums for centuries were melted down for the metal. The 4 bronze horses that adorned the hippodrome were shipped to Venice, where they still decorate St. Mark's Basilica. Relics that Byzantines had collected for centuries, fragments of saints and holy objects that authenticated the city's sacred character, were stolen and distributed across Western Europe. The True Cross fragments, the Virgin's robe, John the Baptist's head, countless others, all taken as plunder. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine historian who witnessed the sack, wrote with bitter eloquence about the destruction. He described Crusaders as worse than Muslims, more savage than barbarians, claiming they destroyed more in 3 days than centuries of warfare had managed. His account drips with contempt for Latin greed and barbarism, contrasting Byzantine civilization with Western crudeness. The emotional wound went deeper than physical damage. This wasn't conquest by foreign enemies, but betrayal by fellow Christians who claimed to serve God while committing sacrilege. The Crusaders installed Baldwin of Flanders as Latin Emperor of Constantinople, carving up Byzantine territories among themselves. The Venetians took strategic islands and ports, creating a maritime empire that controlled eastern Mediterranean trade. Byzantine aristocrats and clergy fled to Nicaea in Asia Minor, to Trebizond on the Black Sea, to Epirus in Greece, establishing rival Byzantine states in exile that claimed to be the true continuation of the empire. Constantinople itself, the new Rome that had stood unconquered for 8 centuries, fell to Latin occupation. The Latin Empire lasted only 57 years before Byzantine forces recaptured Constantinople in 1261. But the city never recovered its former glory. The population had scattered or been killed. The treasury had been looted. The trade networks had been disrupted. The psychological trauma of betrayal by fellow Christians damaged Byzantine confidence in ways military defeats never had. The empire that retook Constantinople in 1261 was a shadow of Justinian's realm, controlling little beyond the capital and fragments of Greece and Asia Minor, surrounded by enemies and doomed to slow contraction. The Fourth Crusade was a turning point from which Byzantium never recovered. It proved the Theodosian walls could be breached, that Constantinople was vulnerable despite its legendary defences. It transferred wealth and artefacts to the west, enriching Italian city-states while impoverishing Byzantium. It deepened the schism between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity into permanent separation, confirmed Byzantine prejudices about Latin barbarism, gave the Orthodox Church institutional independence from Rome that persists today. Most fundamentally, it shattered the illusion that Christendom was a united civilization. Christians could hate each other as thoroughly as they hated Muslims, could destroy each other with equal enthusiasm, could justify any atrocity through theological rationalization. Constantinople's fall to Crusaders in 1204 foreshadowed its fall to Ottomans in 1453, both betrayals of different kinds, both ends of worlds that could never quite be restored. The Byzantine nobles who fled Constantinople in 1204 carried with them the legitimacy of empire, the claim to Rome's unbroken succession, but they left behind the physical heart of their civilization. 3 separate Byzantine successor states emerged from the ruins, each claiming to be the true empire in exile. At Nicaea in northwestern Asia Minor, Theodore Lascaris established the most successful Byzantine remnant, controlling territory, resources, and enough legitimacy that the Patriarch of Constantinople relocated there, bringing ecclesiastical authority to validate political claims. At Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, the Komnenos dynasty founded an independent empire that would outlast Constantinople itself, surviving until 1461. In Epirus on the Greek mainland, another dynasty carved out territory and nursed dreams of reconquest. The empire had fragmented like a mirror struck with a hammer, each piece reflecting distorted images of former unity. The Latin Empire that occupied Constantinople proved remarkably incompetent at actual governance. Baldwin of Flanders, crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia, ruled a hollow shell of conquered territory that he couldn't effectively control or defend. The Byzantine population resented Latin occupation, refused cooperation, engaged in passive resistance and occasional active rebellion. The Orthodox Church rejected union with Rome, went underground rather than submit to papal authority. The economic networks that had made Constantinople wealthy disintegrated as merchants took their business elsewhere, avoiding a city ruled by foreign occupiers who understood neither Byzantine customs nor commercial practices. Militarily, the Latin Empire was doomed from the start. The Crusaders had divided Byzantine territories among themselves in a feudal arrangement that made coordinated defence impossible. Italian city-states, particularly Venice, claimed the profitable ports and islands, leaving the Latin emperors with landlocked regions that generated little revenue. The Bulgarians, led by Tsar Kaloyan, saw opportunity in Byzantine weakness and attacked immediately. In 1205, at the Battle of Adrianople, Kaloyan destroyed a Latin army and captured Emperor Baldwin, who died in captivity. The Latin Empire had lost its founding emperor within a year. The successor emperors who followed Baldwin were increasingly desperate, ruling an empire that consisted of little more than Constantinople itself and a shrinking perimeter around the city. They sold relics to raise money, mortgaged crown jewels to Venetian bankers, begged Western Europe for reinforcements that rarely came. The great city that had been the richest metropolis in Christendom became impoverished, its palaces falling into disrepair, its population declining, its churches stripped of ornament to pay mercenary soldiers. The Latins had conquered Constantinople, but couldn't make the conquest profitable or sustainable. Meanwhile, at Nicaea, the Byzantine government in exile was building genuine state structures that preserved imperial continuity. Theodore Lascaris and his successors maintained the bureaucracy, collected taxes, fielded armies, conducted diplomacy, all the functions of empire compressed into reduced territory, but functionally intact. They rebuilt the military using pronoia grants, estates given to soldiers in exchange for service, adapting the old theme system to new circumstances. They cultivated alliances with the Seljuk Turks and Bulgarians, anyone who opposed the Latin Empire, proving Byzantine diplomacy remained sophisticated even in reduced circumstances. The psychological impact of exile shaped Byzantine culture in unexpected ways. Cut off from Constantinople's libraries and artistic workshops, scholars and artists created new centres of learning at Nicaea and other cities. They copied manuscripts with renewed urgency, aware that Latin occupation threatened to destroy what remained of classical learning. They developed new schools of theology and philosophy, debates about essence and energy, divine simplicity and created light, arguments that would define later orthodox thought. Exile produced cultural renaissance, desperate creativity born from loss and determination to preserve what made them Byzantine. The church hierarchy, relocated to Nicaea but claiming universal authority, refused any compromise with Rome. The memory of crusaders desecrating the Hagia Sophia, seating prostitutes on the patriarch's throne, looting reliquaries for gold burned too hot for reconciliation. Every attempt at church union, every proposal for theological compromise, faced overwhelming opposition from clergy and laity who saw Latin Christianity as heretical contamination. The schism between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, previously more administrative than theological, hardened into permanent separation. Byzantines would rather submit to Muslim rule than accept papal authority, a preference they would eventually act on when Ottoman conquest became inevitable. Trade routes shifted during the Latin occupation, bypassing Constantinople for ports controlled by Nicaea or Italian city-states. The Venetians and Genoese established direct commercial relationships with Black Sea ports, Egyptian markets, and Asian Silk Road terminals, making Constantinople less essential to Eastern Mediterranean commerce. The city's geographic advantage remained, controlling the straits, but Latin mismanagement squandered the monopoly that had enriched Byzantine emperors for centuries. Even after reconquest, Constantinople never fully recovered its commercial dominance, because alternate routes had been established and merchants had learned the city was vulnerable. The Latin Empire's weakness created opportunities for aggressive neighbours. The Second Bulgarian Empire expanded into Thrace and Macedonia, occupying territories that had been Byzantine for centuries. The Seljuk Turks pressed into Western Asia Minor, conquering regions that Nicaea couldn't adequately defend while simultaneously planning reconquest of Constantinople. Serbian kingdoms grew more independent, no longer fearing Byzantine intervention. The power vacuum left by Constantinople's fall reshuffled Balkan politics, creating new kingdoms and empires that would complicate the region's history for centuries. Inside Constantinople, the Latin occupiers lived in a city that resented them, among a population that practiced civil disobedience as art form. Byzantine craftsmen refused to work for Latin employers. Merchants charged Latins higher prices. The remaining Greek population maintained their own parallel society, their own churches and social networks, treating the occupiers as temporary inconvenience rather than legitimate authority. This quiet resistance made effective governance impossible, turned every administrative act into struggle, ensured that Latin rule remained superficial imposition rather than genuine control. The Niaean emperors cultivated reconquest as state ideology, the defining purpose that justified their rule and demanded sacrifice. Michael of Faith. Palaiologos, who became emperor at Nicaea in 1259, made retaking Constantinople his obsession. He conducted patient diplomacy, playing Italian city-states against each other, bribing Venetian nobles to look the other way, negotiating with Genoese merchants who wanted to break Venice's monopoly on Eastern trade. He rebuilt the military methodically, trained elite units, gathered intelligence about Constantinople's defences, waited for the perfect moment. That moment came in July 1261. A small Nicaean force approaching Constantinople discovered the Latin garrison had marched out to campaign elsewhere, leaving the city lightly defended. The Byzantine soldiers entered through a gate opened by sympathetic inhabitants, encountered minimal resistance, reclaimed the capital in a nearly bloodless coup. Michael VIII entered Constantinople in triumph, restored the Byzantine Empire, had himself crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia, with all the traditional ceremonies. The Latin Empire collapsed overnight, its emperor fleeing by ship, its aristocracy scattering to various Aegean holdings, its moment in history over. But the Constantinople Michael VIII reclaimed was damaged almost beyond repair. The population had fallen from perhaps 500,000 at its peak to less than 50,000. Entire neighbourhoods lay abandoned, buildings collapsed or gutted by fire. The great palace complex was a ruin, uninhabitable, forcing emperors to relocate to the Blachanae Palace near the land walls. Churches that had been stripped of ornament remained bare. The imperial treasury was empty, the crown jewels sold or mortgaged, the fiscal system destroyed. The city that had been the richest in Christendom was now impoverished, a shadow of former glory, requiring decades of reconstruction that the empire no longer had resources to accomplish. The territories Michael VIII recovered were likewise diminished. The empire consisted of Constantinople and its immediate hinterland, parts of Greece, scattered Aegean islands and fragments of Western Asia Minor. The vast domains that stretched from Syria to the Danube were gone, divided among Turks and Bulgarians and Serbs and Latins. The empire had shrunk to a medium-sized regional state, still claiming universal authority, still calling itself Rome, but fooling nobody about its actual power. The Fourth Crusade had inflicted wounds that 57 years of exile couldn't heal, damage that would define Byzantine decline through the final 2 centuries, until Ottoman conquest ended the story completely. While the Latin West descended into feudal fragmentation after Rome's fall, Constantinople kept the lamps burning in libraries, where classical learning survived the centuries of turmoil. The Byzantine relationship with classical antiquity was complicated, simultaneously reverent and suspicious. Church fathers condemned pagan philosophy as demonic deception, but couldn't quite abandon Plato and Aristotle, whose logic and metaphysics provided tools for theological argument. Byzantine education required studying classical Greek, reading Homer and Euripides and Thucydides, absorbing cultural heritage that was simultaneously foundational and problematic. They preserved what they couldn't entirely approve, copied manuscripts they weren't sure should be saved, maintained intellectual traditions that contradicted Christian orthodoxy, while being too valuable to discard. This ambivalence created a unique preservation environment. Byzantine scribes copied pagan texts alongside Christian works, ancient science alongside theology, creating libraries that contained both classical philosophy and patristic commentary. Monasteries became manuscript factories, monks spending lifetimes copying books that would otherwise vanish. The work was expensive, requiring parchment made from animal skins, inks made from crushed minerals and oak galls, bindings of leather and wood. Each manuscript represented enormous investment. Making decisions about what to copy literally determinations of what would survive and what would be forgotten. The transition from papyrus to parchment in the 4th and 5th centuries was a critical preservation moment. Papyrus, made from Egyptian reeds, was cheaper but fragile, deteriorating in damp climates, crumbling with age. Parchment, treated animal skin, lasted indefinitely if properly stored. Works copied onto parchment during late antiquity could survive 1,000 years. Works left on papyrus largely vanished. Byzantine scribes working in this transition period decided, consciously or not, which classical authors deserved permanence. Their choices shaped what the Renaissance would rediscover, what modern scholars can study, what parts of ancient literature survived at all. The University at Constantinople, founded by Theodosius II in 425, maintained classical education through centuries when Western European schools taught little beyond basic Latin literacy. Byzantine students studied the trivium of grammar, rhetoric and logic, then the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. They read Homer and Demosthenes in the original Greek, learned mathematical proofs from Euclid, studied geography from Ptolemy, absorbed medical knowledge from Galen and Hippocrates. This education produced bureaucrats who could administer a complex empire, lawyers who could interpret subtle legal codes, theologians who could debate philosophical fine points, all drawing on classical intellectual traditions. The iconoclast controversy, for all its destructiveness, accidentally preserved classical learning. When emperors were destroying religious images in the 8th and 9th centuries, they largely left secular texts alone. Classical manuscripts survived iconoclasm better than religious art because they weren't targets of theological purges. while Western monks were overwriting ancient texts with prayer books, scratching off Cicero to write psalms, Byzantine libraries maintained complete copies of works that existed nowhere else. The accidental nature of this preservation doesn't diminish its importance. Choices made in Constantinople about what deserved shelf space determined what knowledge would reach modernity. When Constantinople fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204, Western looters were more interested in gold reliquaries than dusty manuscripts. But some scholars recognized value in Byzantine libraries and transported books to Italy. These became seeds of Renaissance humanism, Greek texts that Italian scholars could finally read in the original, rather than depending on flawed Arabic translations retranslated into Latin. Petrarch owned Greek manuscripts he couldn't read but treasured anyway, hoping someday someone could teach him the language. His hope was fulfilled when Byzantine refugees fleeing Turkish expansion brought not just manuscripts but knowledge of classical Greek to Italian cities. The fall of Nicaea to the Turks in 1261, the subsequent pressure on Byzantine territories, the slow contraction toward final collapse in Constantinople, all produced waves of refugee scholars carrying manuscripts and learning westward. These weren't barbarian invasions, but transfers of high culture, Greek-speaking intellectuals bringing classical texts, mathematical treatises, Platonic dialogues, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, everything Byzantine libraries had preserved. They settled in Venice, Florence, Rome, founding academies and teaching Greek, sparking interest in texts that challenged medieval assumptions and opened new intellectual possibilities. Manuel Chrysoloras, Byzantine diplomat and scholar, was invited to Florence in 1397 to teach Greek. His students included the humanists who would drive the Renaissance, men who learned to read Plato and Homer in the original, who recognized that medieval Latin translations had distorted ancient thought, who developed new methods of textual analysis and historical criticism. Chrysoloras brought more than language instruction. He brought Byzantine scholarly traditions, ways of reading texts carefully, comparing manuscripts, identifying interpolations, reconstructing original meanings. Renaissance humanism was built on Byzantine foundations. The Council of Florence in 1438 brought Byzantine and Latin churches together for a futile attempt at reunion, but the real importance was cross-cultural exchange. Byzantine scholars debated Catholic theologians using sophisticated arguments drawn from Greek patristics that Western churchmen had never encountered. They demonstrated that Eastern Christianity had maintained separate theological traditions, different ways of understanding the same doctrines, intellectual sophistication that challenged Latin monopoly on defining orthodoxy. The debates failed to unite the churches but succeeded in showing Western scholars that Greek learning was alive and worth studying. Bessarion, Byzantine cardinal who converted to Catholicism but maintained Greek cultural identity, collected one of the Renaissance's finest manuscript libraries. He donated it to Venice, where it became core of the Marciana Library, making Greek texts available to generations of scholars. His collection included works of Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, mathematical texts, astronomical observations, medical treatises, everything he could preserve from Byzantine intellectual tradition. This single collection shaped European philosophy, science, and literature for centuries, all because one Byzantine scholar recognized cultural catastrophe was imminent and tried to save what he could. The printing press multiplied preservation's impact. Once Greek texts reached Italy, they could be printed and distributed widely, making rare manuscripts available to hundreds of readers instead of the handful who could access the unique copies. Aldus Manutius established the Aldine Press in Venice in 1494, printed beautiful editions of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, making classical texts affordable and portable. Most of these editions were based on Byzantine manuscripts brought west by refugee scholars. The technology was Western, but the content was Byzantine, preserved through 1,000 years and finally democratized through printing. Byzantine impact on Islamic scholarship was equally profound. When Arab armies conquered Syria and Egypt in the 7th century, they inherited Hellenistic cities where Greek learning was still studied. Byzantine scholars who converted to Islam or worked for Muslim patrons translated Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, Euclid into Arabic. These translations, improved and commented on by Islamic philosophers and scientists, eventually returned to the West through Spain and Sicily, bringing Greek knowledge that Western Europe had forgotten. The transmission was circular, Greek to Byzantine to Arabic to Latin, with Byzantines playing crucial roles at multiple stages. The preservation of Roman law through Justinian's codification had immense impact on European legal development. Medieval universities taught law from Byzantine texts, the digest and institutes becoming foundational documents for civil law traditions. The concept of natural law, the relationship between divine and human legislation, the principles of jurisprudence, all drew on Byzantine legal scholarship that preserved and synthesized 1,000 years of Roman legal thinking. Modern legal systems in continental Europe and their colonial descendants owe debts to Byzantine preservation of Roman law. Without Byzantine preservation, the Renaissance might never have happened, or would have developed very differently, lacking access to classical sources that inspired humanist rebellion against medieval scholasticism. Plato would be a name without texts. Aristotle would be known only through limited Latin translations from Arabic. Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy, Galen's medicine, all the foundations of classical science might have vanished. Byzantine civilization, usually remembered for failing to prevent Constantinople's fall, deserves equal recognition for succeeding in preserving the intellectual heritage that made modern Western civilization possible. They kept the books safe through 1,000 years of invasions, religious conflicts, political upheavals, economic crises, and when their empire finally fell, they carried those books to new homes where their contents could spark new renaissances, new enlightenments, new ways of thinking that still shape how we understand the world. She was born sometime around 500 into the lowest imaginable circumstances, a bearkeeper's daughter in the hippodrome, entertainment world that respectable society considered barely better than prostitution. Her father kept bears for the animal shows that accompanied chariot races, a job that placed the family among Constantinople's urban poor, dependent on crowd-pleasing spectacles for survival. When he died, her mother remarried quickly, finding another bearkeeper who could support the family. Young Theodora grew up in the hippodrome's shadow, that massive arena where blues and greens competed not just in races, but in political influence, where mob violence could overthrow emperors, where the line between entertainment and riot was dangerously thin. This was her world, coarse and loud and spectacular, nothing like the marble palaces and silk-draped churches where power actually resided. She became an actress, which in Byzantine society meant something very different from modern theatrical respectability. Actresses performed in mimes and farces that often featured sexual content, stripping to near nudity, acting out scenarios that ranged from merely suggestive to explicitly pornographic. They were assumed to be available for prostitution, to supplement theatrical income by entertaining wealthy patrons privately. Byzantine law classed actresses with prostitutes, pimps, and gladiators, people whose moral degradation excluded them from normal society. Senators were legally forbidden from marrying actresses, a prohibition that recognized these women existed beyond respectable boundaries. The historian Procopius, who wrote official histories praising Emperor Justinian, also wrote a secret history that reads like pornographic revenge fantasy, detailing Theodora's supposed sexual exploits in lurid detail. He claimed she performed on stage with geese pecking grain from her naked body, that she serviced 30 men in a single night and complained there weren't more, that she was shameless prostitute whose elevation to empress proved cosmic injustice. Scholars debate how much of this was true, how much exaggeration, how much outright fabrication driven by Procopius's hatred of Theodora's political power. Probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle, acknowledging she came from genuinely scandalous background without accepting every obscene detail. What's certain is that she attracted Justinian's attention, possibly as young man before he became emperor, possibly when he was already heir apparent to his uncle Justin. He fell in love with her, or at least became obsessed with her, wanted to marry her despite the enormous social gap between future emperor and hippodrome actress. His uncle Justin, reigning emperor, initially opposed the match. The Empress Euphemia, Justin's wife, refused to allow it while she lived, but Euphemia died in 523. The legal prohibition against senatorial marriages to actresses was conveniently repealed, and Justinian married Theodora in 525, 2 years before he became emperor. She was crowned Augusta alongside him in 527, made co-ruler not just in title, but in practice. Byzantine empresses usually played ceremonial roles, appearing at public functions in impressive costumes, bearing heirs, patronizing churches, staying carefully out of political decision-making. Theodora was different. She attended state councils, received ambassadors independently, corresponded with foreign rulers in her own name, controlled appointments and patronage networks, exercised authority that made her effectively co-emperor. Justinian consulted her on everything, valued her political judgment, allowed her to pursue policies he disagreed with when she felt strongly about them. The Nika riots in 532 proved her courage and saved Justinian's throne. When the Blues and Greens united against the emperor, when riots consumed Constantinople in fire and violence, when rebels proclaimed a rival emperor and Justinian prepared to flee by ship, Theodora delivered the speech that changed everything. Procopius, even in his secret history hostility, recorded her words and couldn't deny their impact. She told Justinian that purple made a fine burial shroud, that she would rather die an empress than live a refugee, that emperors who fled from their subjects deserved contempt, not loyalty. Her courage shamed Justinian into staying. Her resolve stiffened his spine, and her advice to use military force rather than negotiation led to Belisarius trapping the rioters in the Hippodrome and massacring 30,000 of them, ending the rebellion through overwhelming violence. She used her power to advance women's interests in ways unusual for the period. She established a convent called metanoia, repentance, where former prostitutes could retire from the sex trade with financial support and physical protection. She advocated for laws that prohibited forced prostitution, that gave women more rights in divorce and property ownership, that protected women from being sold by desperate families. These weren't radical feminist reforms by modern standards, but they showed concern for women's welfare that was unusual in Byzantine law, possibly rooted in her own experiences of exploitation and vulnerability. Her religious views created political complications. Theodora supported monophysite Christianity, the belief that Christ had a single divine nature rather than both divine and human natures. This position had been condemned as heresy at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, but it remained popular in Egypt and Syria, and among common people who found Chalcedonian two-nature theology confusing and suspiciously rationalistic. Justinian officially supported Chalcedonian orthodoxy, but he allowed Theodora to protect monophysite clergy, to host them in the palace, to prevent their persecution. This created a bizarre situation where emperor and empress publicly disagreed on fundamental theological questions, each pursuing contradictory religious policies simultaneously. She maintained her own intelligence networks, agents and informants who reported to her rather than the emperor, giving her independent sources of information about threats and opportunities. She corresponded secretly with the monophysite Patriarch of Alexandria, with Persian nobles, with rebel leaders in Italy, conducting parallel foreign policy that sometimes contradicted official Byzantine positions. Justinian knew about this and permitted it, trusting her judgment or at least recognizing he couldn't control her without destroying their partnership. Their marriage was genuine political alliance, mutual dependence between two strong personalities who needed each other's strengths. When she died in 548, probably from cancer, though sources are unclear, Justinian was devastated. He had ruled with her for 21 years, relied on her counsel, valued her political instincts. Without her, he became more isolated, more rigid in his decisions, less willing to compromise or consider alternative perspectives. The last 17 years of his reign, from Theodora's death to his own in 565, saw his grand projects falter and his reconquest of the West begin to unravel. Historians debate how much of this was causation versus coincidence, but Justinian himself seemed diminished after losing his empress. Her legacy transcended her scandalous origins. Byzantine writers after her death couldn't quite dismiss her despite her background, because she had wielded genuine power effectively, had saved the empire during the Nika crisis, had influenced law and religion and foreign policy in ways that outlasted her. She proved that social mobility was possible in Byzantine society despite rigid hierarchies, that women could exercise political authority despite patriarchal norms, that personal ability could overcome almost any disadvantage of birth. Her rise from hippodrome actress to empress became legendary, inspiring and scandalizing later generations in equal measure. Orthodox Christianity eventually canonized Theodora as a saint, honored on February 14th, though which Theodora is unclear since several Byzantine empresses shared the name. The Theodora who restored icon veneration in 843 was a different person, but they blend together in popular memory, powerful women who shaped Byzantine history. If the actress Empress is indeed among those honoured as saint, it represents extraordinary redemption arc. Woman whose sexual past supposedly made her morally unfit for human society, elevated to spiritual exemplar worthy of veneration. Truth or legend, the story captures something essential about Byzantine civilization, its capacity for transformation, its mixing of sacred and profane, its recognition that human complexity defied simple categories of pure and impure, righteous and wicked, worthy and unworthy of remembering across the centuries. The Turks arrived on the scene as nomadic warriors from Central Asia, hired as mercenaries by various Islamic dynasties, useful for fighting but not considered politically important until they started building empires of their own. The Seljuk Turks conquered most of Byzantine Asia Minor in the 11th century, following the catastrophic Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where they destroyed a Byzantine army and captured Emperor Romanos IV. The empire never fully recovered those territories, couldn't muster resources to push the Turks out permanently, watched helplessly as agricultural heartland and military recruitment ground was transformed into Turkish emirates. By the 13th century, Asia Minor was more Turkish than Greek, the demographic transformation complete. Byzantine control reduced to coastal cities and scattered fortresses that survived through local agreements and tribute payments. Among the various Turkish beyliks, frontier principalities competing for territory and prestige, one proved unusually successful. Osman I, whose name would give the Ottoman dynasty its title, ruled a small territory in northwestern Anatolia in the late 13th century. His principality bordered Byzantine territory directly, making it a Ghazi state, a frontier zone where holy war against Christian infidels provided religious justification for expansion. Osman's warriors attracted ambitious fighters from across the Turkish world, men seeking glory and plunder and paradise through combat with unbelievers, creating military culture intensely focused on conquest. The Ottomans expanded methodically, absorbing neighbouring Turkish emirates through conquest or alliance, chipping away at Byzantine holdings in Asia Minor. They understood siege warfare, built effective cavalry armies, developed administrative systems that could govern conquered territories rather than just raiding them. Under Osman and his son Orhan, the Ottoman state transformed from tribal confederation to centralized sultanate, from frontier raiding force to empire with serious ambitions. They established a capital at Bursa, built mosques and markets, created infrastructure of permanent state rather than temporary warband. In 1354, the Ottomans crossed into Europe, establishing their first foothold on the Balkan Peninsula. A combination of opportunity and Byzantine weakness enabled this critical expansion. Earthquake damage had weakened fortifications along the Dardanelles. Byzantine civil war between rival emperors made coordinated defence impossible. The Ottomans occupied Gallipoli and refused to leave, creating permanent base for expansion into Thrace and Greece. Within a generation, they controlled more European territory than the Byzantine Empire, had shifted their capital from Bursa to Adrianople, modern Edirne, in Thrace, signalling that their future lay in Europe, not Asia. The Byzantine response to Ottoman expansion was paralysed by internal divisions and external threats from multiple directions. The empire was engaged in civil wars throughout the 14th century, rival claimants to the throne hiring Turkish and Serbian mercenaries to fight each other, devastating what little territory remained under Byzantine control. The Serbs were expanding their own kingdom, conquering Byzantine territories in Greece and Macedonia. The Venetians and Genoese controlled Byzantine trade, sucking wealth from the empire while providing minimal military support. The Byzantines were surrounded, outnumbered, broke, and politically dysfunctional. Ottoman military innovation made them increasingly formidable opponents. They developed the Janissary Corps, elite infantry recruited through devshirme, the practice of taking Christian boys from conquered territories, converting them to Islam, and training them as fanatically loyal soldiers. These troops were disciplined, professional, equipped with the latest military technology including gunpowder weapons that Europeans were only beginning to adopt. Ottoman armies combined Turkish cavalry with Janissary infantry and Christian vassals who provided auxiliary troops, creating combined arms forces more effective than anything Byzantines could field. Diplomatically, the Ottomans played Byzantine factions against each other, supporting imperial claimants in exchange for territory and tribute. John Cantacuzénos, one of the civil war contenders in the 1440s, allied with Ottoman Sultan Orhan, even gave his daughter Theodora in marriage to the Muslim ruler. This scandalized Orthodox Christians, but seemed pragmatic necessity to Byzantine aristocrats desperate for military support. The alliance brought Turkish troops into Byzantine civil conflicts, familiarized them with Byzantine defenses, showed them the empire's internal weakness, made later conquest easier by demonstrating how divided and vulnerable Byzantium had become. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where Ottomans defeated a Serbian coalition, eliminated the last major Balkan power that might have checked Ottoman expansion. Serbian principalities became Ottoman vassals, required to provide troops for future conquests, including the eventual siege of Constantinople. The Byzantines watched neighbouring Christian kingdoms fall one by one. Understanding their own turn was coming, but unable to forge effective alliances or reform internal weaknesses that made them vulnerable. Appeals to Western Europe for crusades brought occasional responses but never sustained military support necessary to reverse Ottoman gains. The Ottomans besieged Constantinople repeatedly in the 14th and early 15th centuries, testing defences, learning weaknesses, applying pressure that forced Byzantine emperors to pay tribute and accept humiliating terms. In 1402, Sultan Bayezid prepared for final assault on the city, but Timur's invasion from the east disrupted Ottoman plans. Timur, claiming to restore Mongol Empire, attacked Anatolia, destroyed Ottoman armies, captured Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara. This unexpected intervention gave Byzantium 50-year reprieve, but it was reprieve not rescue, temporary pause not permanent salvation. During the Ottoman interregnum that followed Timur's invasion, when Bayezid's sons fought civil war over succession, Byzantines tried playing rival Ottoman princes against each other. Emperor Manuel II toured Western Europe seeking crusade support, visited Paris and London, was received with honour but gained little practical military aid. Western powers were engaged in the 100 Years' War, dealing with their own crises, unwilling to commit resources to save distant Greek Empire most considered schismatic heretics anyway. The union of churches, making Byzantium Catholic in exchange for Western military support, was proposed repeatedly, but Orthodox populations violently opposed it, making political alliance with Rome nearly impossible. The Ottomans recovered from Timur's disruption stronger than before. Sultan Mehmed I reunited Ottoman territories, stabilized administration, rebuilt military power. His son Murad II resumed Balkan expansion, conquering Serbian and Hungarian territories, crushing crusades sent against him. The Varna Crusade in 1444, one of the last major Western attempts to stop Ottoman expansion, ended in catastrophic defeat when King Władysław of Poland and Hungary was killed in battle and the crusading army destroyed. The loss eliminated any realistic hope that Western Europe would save Constantinople. By the 1440s, Byzantium consisted of Constantinople, a few islands and small territories in Greece, nominally controlled by Byzantine despots who were effectively Ottoman vassals. The emperor was tributary to the Sultan, paying annual tribute, consulting Ottoman approval for policy decisions, essentially a client ruler in what had been the capital of Eastern Christendom. The relationship was humiliating but necessary for survival, buying time in hope that somehow circumstances might change, that a miracle might save the empire that had survived so many previous catastrophes. The final Ottoman sultan who would accomplish what his predecessors had attempted repeatedly was Mehmed II, who came to power in 1451 at age 19. He was intelligent, ambitious, well-educated in multiple languages and cultures, determined to achieve conquest of Constantinople that would establish his reputation and fulfill Islamic prophecies about taking the Christian capital. He began preparations immediately, building fortress on the Bosphorus to control maritime traffic, assembling siege artillery including massive cannon that could breach the Theodosian walls, gathering troops from across the Ottoman Empire and its vassals for the final assault. The Byzantines watched these preparations with fatalistic resignation, understanding the end was coming and they lacked resources to prevent it. The 1,000-year empire was approaching its final chapter, waiting for walls to fall that had protected Constantinople since the 5th century, preparing for transformation from Christian bastion to Islamic capital. Something extraordinary happened in 14th and 15th century Byzantium a cultural flowering that occurred precisely when the empire was dying. Art and scholarship achieving new heights even as territory and population collapsed toward extinction. The Palaiologos dynasty, which reclaimed Constantinople from Latin occupation in 1261 and ruled until the Ottoman conquest in 1453, presided over cultural renaissance that rivaled any period in Byzantine history. This wasn't nostalgia or mere preservation of ancient forms, but genuine creativity. New ideas in theology and philosophy, revolutionary developments in painting and architecture, literary production that interrogated Byzantine identity with sophisticated self-awareness. The empire was contracting into irrelevance politically, but intellectually and artistically it was more vital than it had been for centuries. The theology of Gregory Palamas exemplified this intellectual innovation. He was a monk from Mount Athos who developed elaborate theory distinguishing between God's essence, which is unknowable and cannot be experienced, and God's energies, which permeate creation and can be encountered through prayer and ascetic practice. This resolved paradox of how humans can experience God while God remains transcendent, allowing mystical union without collapsing the infinite gulf between creator and creation. The Palamite controversy consumed Byzantine theological attention in the 1340s, sparked political conflicts and synods and excommunications, but ultimately shaped Orthodox theology in ways that persist to the present. Hesychasm, the contemplative prayer practice Palamas defended, became central to Orthodox spirituality. Monks using specific breathing techniques, body postures, and repetitive prayer aimed to achieve theoria, direct vision of God's uncreated light, the same radiance that shone from Christ at the Transfiguration. This wasn't mere metaphor, but literal claim that humans could see divine light with physical eyes through proper spiritual training. The practices were ancient, but their theological justification and widespread adoption dated to this late Byzantine period, another example of innovation disguised as traditional piety. Art in the Palaiologos era developed distinctive style that broke from earlier Byzantine rigidity. The mosaics and frescoes of the Chora Church in Constantinople, created in the early 1400s, show new interest in narrative drama, psychological depth, spatial relationships that suggest three-dimensional scenes rather than flat, iconic images. The defenders woke one morning to find 70 Ottoman ships inside the Golden Horn, the sea walls now threatened from direction that had been secure. This forced Constantine to spread his limited forces even thinner, defending the entire perimeter rather than concentrating at the land walls where the main assault would come. The final assault began before dawn on May 29th, after 7 weeks of siege. Mehmed launched everything simultaneously, attacks on all sections of the walls, naval assaults from both sides, the great cannon firing until it cracked and exploded from the heat. The irregulars and auxiliary troops went first, absorbing defender arrows and stones, exhausting them before the elite janissaries attacked. Somewhere near the Romanus Gate, probably at a small postern gate that had been left open or inadequately defended, Ottoman troops broke through the outer wall and gained foothold inside the fortifications. Justinian was wounded, possibly by arrow or gunshot, and was carried from the walls to be evacuated by ship. His removal broke the defence's cohesion, created panic among soldiers who had relied on his leadership. The janissaries poured through the breach, overwhelmed defenders who were exhausted after 7 weeks of constant combat, killed anyone who resisted and enslaved those who surrendered. The Byzantine defence collapsed not through cowardice, but through simple mathematics. Too few defenders spread across too much perimeter, no reserves to plug gaps, no hope of reinforcement or relief. Constantine's final moments are shrouded in legend and uncertainty. No reliable witness recorded his death. The most common story says he discarded imperial regalia to avoid being identified, drew his sword, and charged into the Ottoman soldiers pouring through the breached walls, dying as anonymous soldier rather than captured emperor. Other accounts claim he was killed on the walls, or trying to rally fleeing troops, or in last stand near the imperial palace. His body was never definitively identified, though Ottomans later claimed to have found it and buried it with respect appropriate to fallen emperor. The city fell by mid-morning. Ottoman soldiers poured through breached walls and open gates, began the traditional 3 days of looting that Islamic law permitted to armies that took cities by storm. Churches were ransacked, citizens enslaved, buildings burned or vandalized. the Hagia Sophia filled with people seeking sanctuary, believing the sacred building would protect them, but Ottoman troops broke down the doors and enslaved everyone inside. Mehmed entered the city that afternoon, rode to the Hagia Sophia, ordered it immediately converted to mosque, climbed to the dome where emperors had been crowned for 9 centuries, and gave thanks to Allah for granting him this victory. Constantinople, the new Rome that had stood unconquered for 1100 years, fell in a single day. The Roman Empire that claimed unbroken continuity from Augustus to the Palaiologoi ended with Constantine XV's death in the rubble of walls that had protected civilization when Western Europe was barbarous wilderness. The revelation wasn't theological but historical, the understanding that nothing lasts forever, that empires built on seemingly eternal foundations can collapse when circumstances align against them, that cultural sophistication and long tradition, and claims to divine favour, provide no immunity to conquest when military technology and demographic numbers favour the enemy. Byzantium had survived so many crises that its citizens half believed it really was eternal, that God would never permit Constantinople's fall. Constantine XV knew better, accepted the throne anyway, and died defending an empire that existed primarily in memory and aspiration. Final emperor of a state that had already outlived its political viability, but insisted on dying with honour rather than surrendering without fight. The Byzantine Empire fell 542 years ago, yet its influence persists in ways most people never recognise, shapes cultures and institutions and ideas that seem to have no connection to medieval Constantinople. Orthodox Christianity is the most obvious legacy. 250 million adherents worldwide who worship in traditions developed in Byzantium, liturgies written in Constantinople, theology debated in Byzantine councils, artistic forms created by Byzantine iconographers. The Russian Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox, Serbian, Bulgarian, Romanian, all trace their practices and beliefs through Byzantine Christianity, consider themselves heirs to traditions that predate the schism with Rome, that maintained theological purity while Western Christianity supposedly devolved into papal innovations. The Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, still used in Orthodox services, was standardized in Constantinople 1500 years ago, words and gestures preserved across centuries with remarkable continuity. The architecture of Orthodox churches directly descends from Byzantine models. The cross in square plan, central dome supported on 4 pillars, apses and narthex arranged in traditional layout, all developed in Middle Byzantine period and replicated across Orthodox world. Russian onion domes are adaptations of Byzantine cupolas, modified for climates where snow would accumulate on traditional hemispheres. The interior decoration follows Byzantine principles, hierarchical arrangement with Christ Pantocrator in the dome, the Virgin in the apse, saints on the walls, creating cosmic map where heaven descends to earth through sacred imagery, arranged according to precise theological logic. Iconography remains distinctly Byzantine despite 5 centuries of separation from Constantinople. The style, the conventions, the theology of icons, all derive from traditions established and defended during the iconoclast controversy. Modern iconographers still follow Byzantine manuals that specify proportions, colours, gestures, the proper way to depict Christ or the Virgin or various saints. The reverse perspective, the flattened space, the gold backgrounds, the enormous eyes, all features that developed in Byzantine art for theological reasons, and persist in contemporary Orthodox practice, because they're considered not merely artistic choices, but essential to our icon's spiritual function. Civil law in continental Europe and former European colonies derives substantially from Justinian's legal codification. The Corpus Juris Civilis formed the basis of legal education in medieval universities, provided framework for developing national legal systems, established principles of jurisprudence that influence modern law. The concept that law should be systematic and written, that it should be studied as intellectual discipline requiring specialized education, that precedent and logical interpretation matter more than mere custom, all owe debts to Byzantine legal tradition. Modern contract law, property law, family law, all contain elements traceable to Roman law as preserved and developed by Byzantine jurists. The Cyrillic alphabet used across Eastern Europe and former Soviet states was created by Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius in the 9th century to write Slavic languages previously unwritten. They based the script on Greek alphabet with modifications for Slavic sounds, allowing translation of Christian texts into languages that could be written for the first time. This cultural imperialism, spreading Orthodox Christianity through liturgical language local populations could understand, tied Slavic peoples to Byzantine civilization, created sphere of cultural influence that persists in Orthodox Christianity's distribution across Eastern Europe and Russia. Byzantine diplomacy influenced European political culture in ways rarely acknowledged. The concept of using marriage alliances to cement political relationships, of maintaining elaborate intelligence networks, of playing enemies against each other rather than relying solely on military force, all techniques the Byzantines refined and practiced with sophistication that Western European courts eventually adopted. The court ceremonial that surrounded monarchies, the elaborate protocols and titles and rituals designed to project power through spectacle rather than just military might, drew inspiration from Byzantine models filtered through various intermediaries. The artistic influence extended beyond Orthodox Christianity into Islamic culture. The Ottomans, who conquered Constantinople, absorbed Byzantine administrative practices, adapted Byzantine tax systems, employed former Byzantine bureaucrats who knew how to run complex states. Ottoman architecture was influenced by Byzantine models, the great mosques of Istanbul showing clear descent from Hagia Sophia's spatial logic and structural techniques. The Ottomans saw themselves as successors to Byzantine Empire, claimed its prestige and administrative sophistication while imposing Islamic overlay, creating hybrid culture that preserved more Byzantine elements than they cared to admit. The Renaissance owed enormous debt to Byzantine preservation of classical texts. Without Byzantine libraries and refugee scholars carrying manuscripts west, the humanist revolution might never have occurred or would have developed very differently. The rediscovery of classical learning that sparked new approaches to art, literature, science, philosophy, politics, all depended on texts that survived only because Byzantine scribes copied them for centuries when Western Europe had forgotten they existed. The Renaissance was partly reappropriation of Western heritage, but it was mediated through Byzantine preservation and required Byzantine expertise to unlock. The concept of empire itself, particularly the idea of Christian empire, universal sovereignty blessed by divine authority, came to Western Europe largely through Byzantine models. Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 was a deliberate attempt to recreate Roman Empire in the West, implicitly acknowledging that Byzantium held legitimate claim to that heritage. The competition between Eastern and Western empires, between Orthodox and Catholic versions of Christian universal monarchy, shaped medieval European politics and continued influencing political thought long after both empires had collapsed. Modern historical consciousness owes something to Byzantine historians, who preserved records and developed analytical approaches to understanding political change. The chronicles and histories written in Constantinople maintained awareness of classical past, created narratives that connected contemporary events to Rome's foundation, provided Europeans with sense of continuity across centuries that might otherwise have seemed hopelessly fragmented. Without Byzantine historical writing, the Middle Ages might have lost connection to classical antiquity entirely, might have developed without awareness that they were heirs to traditions stretching back millennia. The tragedy of Byzantine history, the slow decline from superpower to besieged enclave, has influenced how we think about civilizational collapse. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, one of the foundational texts of modern historical writing, was really about Byzantine decline, and Gibbon's thesis that Christianity weakened Rome shaped how generations understood religion's relationship to political power. Whether Gibbon was right or wrong, his interpretation established framework for thinking about how civilizations fail that still influences contemporary analysis of empires in decline. The very word Byzantine has acquired meanings far beyond the medieval empire. We call something Byzantine when it's excessively complicated, bureaucratic, characterized by elaborate intrigue and labyrinthine complexity. This usage is somewhat unfair to actual Byzantine civilization, which was often quite efficient and pragmatic, but it captures the Western perception of Eastern complexity, the sense that Constantinople represented different civilization from Western European models, more sophisticated perhaps, but also more alien and inscrutable. What Byzantium ultimately means is that civilization is more than political power, that cultural influence can outlast military strength, that ideas and art and institutions can survive the states that created them. The Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, but Byzantine civilization continued in Orthodox Christianity, in Cyrillic alphabet, in legal codes and artistic traditions and historical consciousness. Empires are mortal, but what they create sometimes endures, sometimes shapes successor cultures in ways that transform across centuries while maintaining surprising continuity. Constantinople is Istanbul now. The Hagia Sophia is a mosque converted to museum, converted back to mosque. The walls still stand but protect different city for different civilization. Yet the past persists in present. Byzantine influence is recognizable to anyone who knows what to look for, echoes of vanished empire that refuse to be completely forgotten. Evening settles over Istanbul now as it settled over Constantinople for 11 centuries, the light softening across the Golden Horn, the last sun touching domes and minarets, where it once gilded crosses and Byzantine standards. The city has been Ottoman for 542 years, longer than it was Byzantine after Constantine's founding in 330. The Turkish Republic replaced Ottoman Empire in 1923, secular state that transformed Istanbul from imperial capital to commercial metropolis, modernizing and expanding far beyond the old walls that once contained everything that mattered. The city spreads across hills on both European and Asian shores, population of 15 million where Byzantine Constantinople held perhaps 500,000 at its peak. The scale has changed beyond anything medieval emperors could have imagined, but the geography remains, the peninsula and the strait and the waters that made this location strategic for 3,000 years. The Hagia Sophia still dominates the skyline, though the building has changed identities multiple times since Justinian dedicated it in 537. Ottoman mosque for nearly 5 centuries after 1453, museum from 1935 to 2020, mosque again in the present. The mosaics that survived iconoclasm and Ottoman conquest were covered and covered again as the building's religious function changed. Christ Pantocrator in the dome, the Virgin and Child in the apse, the Desis mosaic with Christ between Mary and John the Baptist, all hidden under plaster for centuries, rediscovered and restored when the building became museum, now covered again, or at least obscured by lighting and fabric screens. The building endures, but its meaning keeps shifting. Sacred space that different civilizations claim for different gods, while the architecture remains essentially unchanged. The walls that Constantine X died defending still stand in long sections, though modern roads cut through them and neighbourhoods have grown around and over the ancient fortifications. You can walk along the Theodosian walls from the Sea of Marmara toward the Golden Horn, climb towers where Byzantine soldiers watched for enemies, see the triple barriers of moat and outer wall and massive inner wall that made Constantinople impregnable for 1,000 years. Earthquake damage and Ottoman cannon have left their marks, broken sections, repaired segments, places where original Byzantine stonework transitions to later Turkish restoration. The walls have become palimpsest, layers of history visible in the different building techniques, the various repairs and modifications that accumulated across centuries. The Great Palace is gone, its site occupied by Ottoman and modern buildings, but fragments survive in museums. The floor mosaics discovered during construction in the 1950s show hunting scenes and pastoral landscapes and animals in combat, all the secular imagery that decorated imperial spaces. These tiny coloured stones, arranged by anonymous craftsmen 1,500 years ago, outlasted the empire they served, outlasted the building they adorned, survived buried under rubble, and forgetting to be excavated and reassembled and displayed in climate-controlled museums, where tourists photograph them with devices the mosaic makers could never have imagined. The Hippodrome is now Sultan Ahmet Square, a park where tourists gather between the Blue Mosque and Hagia Sophia. The serpent column still stands, headless and weathered but recognizable, bronze coils that were already ancient when Constantine brought them from Delphi. The Egyptian obelisk remains on its marble base, hieroglyphics recording Pharaoh Thutmose III's victories 3,500 years ago, transported to Constantinople to demonstrate imperial power over space and time. These monuments have outlived the empire that collected them, outlived the Hippodrome where chariot racers could overthrow emperors, stand now as curiosities in a city that barely remembers their significance. Byzantine churches scatter across Istanbul, most converted to mosques, their Christian iconography plastered over or removed, their function transformed but their architecture preserved. The Pamukharistos Church, Fethiye Mosque now retains Byzantine mosaics in a side chapel that was never converted. The Kura Church, Carrier Museum, keeps its extraordinary frescoes and mosaics. Last Judgment and Anastasis and Virgin's Life Cycle, golden figures on curved surfaces that seem to move in candlelight or changing sun. These buildings are fragments of vanished cityscape, survivors of transformation that destroyed or altered most Byzantine architecture, witnesses to aesthetic that continues influencing anyone who sees them. The city's function has changed completely. Byzantine Constantinople was political capital, religious centre, commercial hub for empire that claimed universal sovereignty. Ottoman Istanbul was capital of Islamic Empire, seat of caliphate, centre of Muslim world for 4 centuries. Modern Istanbul is commercial metropolis in secular republic, economic rather than political capital, bridge between Europe and Asia that's more metaphor than reality in age of air travel and digital communication. The strategic significance of the Bosphorus persists, but has changed character, oil tankers and container ships passing through straits that once saw Byzantine dromen and Ottoman galleys. The geography endures while its meaning transforms. Orthodox Christianity maintains presence in Istanbul, tiny compared to Byzantine dominance but continuous across 15 centuries. The ecumenical patriarch still resides in the Fana district, claims spiritual leadership of world orthodoxy from modest compound in city where patriarchs once advised emperors. The community is small now, few thousand Greeks in city of 15 million, but they maintain traditions, celebrate liturgies in Byzantine Greek, preserve connection to heritage that predates the conquest. Their persistence is itself remarkable. Minority maintaining identity across 5 centuries of Muslim rule, refusing complete assimilation, keeping memory alive. Scholars continue excavating Byzantine Constantinople beneath Ottoman and Turkish layers, discovering cisterns and walls and churches buried under later construction. Each new finding adds detail to the map of vanished city, helps reconstruct how neighbourhoods were organised, where markets functioned, how water systems worked. Archaeological work is detective story conducted through brick and stone and pottery shards, piecing together daily life from fragments that survived. The city keeps revealing secrets, keeps offering evidence about past that lived and died, and left traces for patient excavators to discover. The question that Byzantine history poses is whether civilizations ever truly die, or whether they transform and persist in unexpected ways. The empire ended in 1453, political continuity broken, dynasty extinguished, institutions dissolved. But Byzantine culture survived in Orthodox Christianity, in preserved texts, in artistic traditions, in legal codes, in historical memory. The empire is dead, but Byzantium lives, not as political entity but as cultural influence that shaped civilizations and continues affecting how people worship and create and think about law and beauty and the relationship between sacred and secular. Constantinople became Istanbul, but the transformation was absorption, not erasure. The Ottomans didn't destroy the city but occupied and adapted it, made it capital of their own empire, drew on Byzantine administrative expertise and architectural models. Modern Turkey maintains ambivalent relationship with Byzantine past, sometimes claiming it as heritage, sometimes rejecting it as alien, generally acknowledging it exists but struggling to integrate it into national narrative that emphasizes Turkish and Islamic identity. The past remains present but contested, layers of meaning that different groups interpret differently according to their own needs and identities. Perhaps the deepest legacy is simple beauty, the art and architecture that Byzantium created, and that survives to inspire wonder across the centuries. The Hagia Sophia's dome still lifts eyes upward, still creates that floating sensation Justinian wanted. The mosaics still glow with transmitted light, gold and coloured glass turning sun into radiance that seems more than physical. The illuminated manuscripts, the ivory carvings, the silk textiles, the enamel work, all the applied arts that Byzantine craftsmen perfected, survive in museums and private collections, testimony to civilization that invested enormous resources in creating beautiful objects because beauty mattered, because making things well honoured God and expressed human dignity and created meaning beyond mere utility. So we return to where we began, to stillness and wonder and the gentle contemplation of vanished worlds that still speak across the silence of centuries. The Byzantine Empire fell, but its light never quite died, kept burning in churches and libraries and artistic traditions, carried west by refugees, and transmitted east through Orthodox Christianity, absorbed into Islamic civilization and Renaissance humanism, influencing cultures that barely remember the source. History is not just rise and fall of empires, but persistence of ideas and art and practices that outlive political states, endure because they carry something essential about human experience, beauty and meaning and connection to transcendent that every civilization seeks and expresses differently, but which somehow survives transformation and conquest and forgetting. The evening settles, the light fades, and somewhere in Istanbul a muezzin calls faithful to prayer from minaret attached to building that was church for 900 years. The call echoes across water that carried Byzantine ships, across land where emperors processed in purple silk and golden crown, across centuries that separate us from Constantinople but can't quite erase it. The past is past, irrecoverable, except through fragments and imagination, but it persists in present, shapes what we are without our always recognizing it. Byzantine evening glows with gold that was real once, literal gold leaf on mosaics and icons and manuscript pages, but also metaphorical gold, the precious heritage that civilization creates and passes on, imperfectly but persistently, the light that refuses to die completely no matter how many empires fall, how many cities are conquered, how many centuries accumulate between then and now. Rest now, knowing that beauty endures, that what matters survives in unexpected forms, that the story continues even when individual chapters close. The empire ended, but the light still glows, faint perhaps but visible to anyone willing to look, to listen, to remember.